Men freeze in place, holding pickaxes and shovels at the ready inside a well-lit tunnel under the Mexican countryside. They can hear the vibrations of a vehicle above them and, wary of making any noise that might give them away, hold their work as the prison patrol passes overhead. 30 feet below the prison's main yard, there's little chance of being discovered. But after several months of secret tunneling, they can't take any chances, especially when they are so close to their goal. The prison cell of Mexico's most famous drug kingpin, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. For months, they've tunneled through solid rock with nothing more than pickaxes and shovels, moving as fast as they can with their limited equipment but with great caution. The work would go much faster if they could use modern tunnel digging equipment like jackhammers and boring machines. But not only would that create noise that might give them away, it would draw a great deal of attention to their staging area, just a mile from the prison perimeter. Prior to tunnel digging, El Chapo's powerful drug cartel purchased a small plot of land as close to the prison as they could get and began constructing 2 small homes as a cover for their real intentions. The homes never made it past a rough brick outer shell though, because of course they would not be inhabited. Instead, they provided the cover needed to start construction on the tunnel that would set El Chapo free. But the tunnel crew was facing incredible pressure to finish as quickly as possible. Due to his history of escaping from prison and evading police raids, Mexican authorities could at any time transfer El Chapo to another prison in order to foil any possible escape attempts. Every day the tunnelers took to get their boss was another day the entire thing could be for nothing, and a new escape attempt in a completely different location would have to be devised. But that's not all. The unfinished buildings were beginning to draw attention from local officials and curious villagers alike. Why would someone start construction on an empty piece of land and then suddenly stop with only a shell of a home built? Time was running out and pressure was mounting. Inside his cell, El Chapo was the model prisoner. Despite his long history of ordering some of the most horrific violence Mexico has ever seen, El Chapo maintained a cordial and even pleasant attitude with his prison guards and fellow inmates. His conversations over the phone were carefully monitored, his mail checked by prison officials, but not a single hint of the ongoing plot was ever revealed. El Chapo was a true professional by now and patient, but his patience was running out. The tunnel diggers faced a daunting task from the start, and they knew they had to move fast. Despite the incredible pressure on them, however, they managed to not only reach El Chapo before any potential prison transfer, but they wound up breaking through to El Chapo's cell just 16 months into his prison stay. The tunnel they constructed was sophisticated, impressing officials who would later remark that a tunnel of that magnitude should have taken 18 months to 2 years to construct. Its walls were reinforced when needed, with wooden paneling, and a generator pumped fresh air through a mile-long ventilation system to keep the tunnel oxygenated. On the ground, the tunnelers had laid down rails and used a motorcycle to shuttle 2 carts, which were filled with dirt back and forth along the shaft. Once El Chapo was reached, he would ride on that same motorcycle and quickly shuttle the mile distance to freedom. All that dirt, though, had to go somewhere, and so the tunnelers cleverly transferred it to the tunnel opening, where others would spread the dirt around on the field outside, rather than dump it in giant piles, which would no doubt draw attention. Still, the presence of fresh dirt littering acres of empty fields was sure to eventually draw attention, and questions that would not be easy to answer for the fake construction crew above ground. Suddenly though, in the middle of the night on July 12, 2015, the sound of metal scraping came from El Chapo's shower inside his cell. Moments later, the ceramic bottom of the shower popped free, and a friendly face greeted the imprisoned drug lord, beckoning him into the darkness below. Wasting no time, El Chapo ducked into the secret tunnel, climbing down 30 feet into a tunnel only as wide across as a man, but just tall enough for El Chapo to stand upright. Often derided for his short stature by his enemies, the tunnel diggers had made sure that the tunnel was just tall enough so the boss wouldn't have to hunch as he walked along it. A classy prison escape if we ever heard of one. A few feet into the mouth of the tunnel, El Chapo boarded a small motorcycle which had been affixed to metal tracks. The carts full of dirt that had pushed along for months now were gone, and just moments after leaving his cell, El Chapo was cruising along the well-lit tunnel like a kid on an amusement park ride. 2 minutes later, El Chapo ended his joyride by climbing up wooden steps and popping up into the empty shell of a home his crew had been secretly working from for a year and a half. Changing into clean clothes, El Chapo then climbed onto a truck and whisked away into the dark of the night, leaving behind an incredible mile-long secret tunnel and completely frustrated prison system and Mexican government both. El Chapo would be caught again just months after his escape, after his newest safe house was given away weeks before his arrival by careless gunmen who were spotted by locals. Responding to reports of heavily armed men, Mexican officials put the house under surveillance and intercepted communications saying that grandma or aunt was coming to visit. Realizing this had to be a high-value target, officials waited for their chance to strike. 1 month later, Mexican Special Forces soldiers raided the home and killed several bodyguards, but El Chapo and one of his most senior lieutenants escaped via, you guessed it, a secret tunnel. Popping up a mile from the home, the two stole a vehicle at gunpoint, though the driver immediately reported it to the police. After issuing an alert for the stolen vehicle, the federal police officers discovered the stolen car and placed the two fugitives under arrest. El Chapo, however, wouldn't go without at least trying to buy his freedom. Knowing how easily corruptible public officials had been in the past, El Chapo bribed the police officers, offering them money, homes, and even lucrative jobs if they let him go. Little did the desperate kingpin know, however, that he was dealing with a brand new brand of Mexican police officer, one not as easily corrupted as his predecessors. All 4 officers refused El Chapo, after which his offers of honey turned into vinegar, telling the police officers that they were all going to die. The 4 officers sent pictures to El Chapo to their superiors, only to be warned that the police had received a tip-off that 40 heavily armed assassins were en route to free El Chapo. With friendly forces still tied up at the compound, the officers were ordered to a nearby motel on the outskirts of town, where they holed themselves up in an empty room and prepared for a possible shootout for their lives. All the while, El Chapo laughed, echoing his previous threats. Suddenly, a convoy of vehicles lit up the roadside, clearly headed for the lonely motel. The officers, armed with M16 assault rifles and pistols, prepared for what was surely their last stand. El Chapo taunted them, telling them they were about to face death, and after them, their families. Yet the officers held their ground, ready to die for duty's sake if need be. As the vehicles began to turn into the parking lot, however, El Chapo's taunts died in his throat. Once the glare of the headlights faded, the barricaded officers could see military trucks full of Mexican Marines rushing to take up defensive positions around the motel. Minutes later, a thoroughly defeated and dejected-looking El Chapo was dragged into an SUV and rushed off to an airfield. El Chapo would not escape from Mexican prison again, and 2 years later, any hope of ever escaping again would be extinguished as Mexico approved an extradition request to the United States. Safely in U.S. custody, El Chapo faces life in prison, and though he may have been one of the deadliest men in Mexico's history, the drug kingpin would ultimately be remembered as nothing more than a sobbing mess as he begged U.S. justice officials for leniency, which they would not grant. At the time of writing, there are 2,738 inmates on death row in the United States. This number can change quite frequently, given that some prisoners, of course, might be executed, but others might have their sentence commuted. They might have their sentence overturned, or someone else might join them on death row. Right now, only 2% of people on death row are women. 42% of people are classified as white, 41% black, 13% Latino, 1.9% Asian, 1% Native American, and the rest is stated as unknown. You can be on death row for a long, long time. And believe it or not, the average time spent there from sentencing to the day in the execution chamber is 20 years. Let's now see what happens on that final day, 8 p.m. The inmate is taken from death row to another cell. This involves a drive from the prison to what one former official in a documentary called the Death House. That official said prior to leaving death row and getting in the van to come to the death house, the inmate will be searched really well. He said this wasn't only because a weapon might harm a guard, but mainly because they don't want the prisoner committing suicide. Another guard interviewed said he once took a route to the death house where they couldn't be ambushed. Tensions are high during these events. He also said the atmosphere in the van was solemn. We all knew where we were going and why. Nobody said a whole lot. Once the prisoner goes into the death house, he won't ever see the light of day again, unless some kind of appeal works for him. 9 p.m. After booking in, he can sleep until he's awakened, if indeed he can sleep. We managed to find the diary of one prisoner who described his move to his new cell. They stripped me out with a female officer present, he wrote. Now, personally, I'm not the shy type, but having a female officer on death watch is just one more humiliation. We're told that during this time, the prisoner is on something called death watch. He's watched all the time in case he tries to take his own life. The cell is close to the execution chamber and it is very private, a space where the inmate can reflect on life as the hours count down. This might happen just one day before, but we found cases where it was a couple of days. Prisoners will also be given special clothes in most cases, much smarter than prison attire. The man who kept the diary wrote he was happy to have at last a pair of trousers with a button and zip. We don't know how well he slept, but in his diary he comments about watching the guards sleep. This is what he wrote. Good for them. I'm sure this has to be stressful for them. So a moment's relaxation is well earned. I also enjoy the irony. Who exactly is watching whom? One other thing he says is that the death house is much cleaner than his death row cell. He remarks that there's not a bug in sight, whereas in his last cell it was like going on safari. 4:30 a.m. The inmate is woken up bright and early in his cell. We should add here times might change from place to place. Petitions might still be pending, and there's a phone right outside the cell. In the cell, there's a shower, a toilet, a bed, and a desk. During this last day, the prisoner is allowed to see family and can be visited by a chaplain. As for calling people, the inmate can write down a list of phone numbers he intends to call and give that to the guards. One guard interviewed said we would dial the number for him and then allow him to make his call. But after the prisoner has called the last person on his list, the only person he'll have to talk to is the chaplain. We're told that after this last call, it can be a very traumatic time. One chaplain interviewed said I was to do everything and anything to help him face that last day, whatever it was, writing letters, making phone calls, singing songs, listening, and listening. 8 a.m. We said they can have visitors, but 8 a.m. is the cutoff time. After that, the prisoner is on his own, besides having prison staff around and, of course, anyone involved in his case should something change. The chaplain can still visit too. At around this time, in the actual death chamber, it's very likely that the equipment will be tested. This might mean checking that the straps on the gurney work, or even checking the phone to the governor's office is working. Yep, imagine it wasn't and there was a last-minute reprieve. If the form of execution is the chair, then its electrical components have to be tested. In one case we found, the actual governor was the person who they strapped in to test if he could get out or move out of the straps. I didn't want my staff to get kicked in the face, he remarked. 10:30 a.m. Now it's lunchtime. Yes, this is an early lunch, but let's not forget the inmate has been up a long time already. Lunch is not special, it's not the last meal. From what we can see, it's the same old prison food. The only difference is that the prisoner gets to eat it in a private setting. The inmate we talked about before said what he got for lunch was orange juice and what he called a prison-issue donut. For quite a few hours now, the prisoner has a lot of time to think, and as you know, they have a desk and can write any number of letters, goodbyes, or just reflect on life. 3 p.m. If the inmate is to get the electric chair, he'll have his head shaved around this time. But this might also happen later in the day. He might still talk to a spiritual advisor, but food might also be on his mind right now. Around this time, maybe an hour or so later, the inmate will also be asked to dress in one of those smart clothes he's been given. He'll be asked to take a shower before he does this, a shower at least in total privacy. He'll have already written down what he wants to eat, so in the kitchen the death house chef will be doing all the preparations. 4 p.m. The inmate will receive his last meal. Contrary to popular belief, inmates can't just order what they want. It makes sense because it's highly unlikely that authorities would splash out on the finest Wagyu beef. In Florida, for instance, the maximum this last meal can cost is $40, but this will change from state to state. Those poor convicts over in Oklahoma only get a limit of $15, or at least when one documentary we watched was made. That is hardly enough to go crazy on your last meal. It's still good though. As one death house chef pointed out, this meal is the only choice of food they might have had in 2 decades. In some states though, prisoners no longer get a bespoke last meal and only get the usual prison food. To give you an idea of what inmates might choose, we will list some last meals. Serial killer John Wayne Gacy had 12 fried shrimp, an entire bucket of KFC, some French fries, and a whole load of strawberries. The man behind the Oklahoma bombing, Timothy McVeigh, just opted for 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. A killer from Florida called Angel Nieves Diaz chose absolutely nothing. The terrible Ted Bundy did pretty much the opposite, ordering a steak cooked medium rare, eggs on the side, over easy, some hash browns, slices of toast, and some milk and juice. The infamous female serial killer Eileen Wuornos was good with just a cup of coffee, while a murderer called Stephen Woods must have been famished. We should add that many thought he was innocent and his last words were, "You're not about to witness an execution, you're about to witness a murder." Before that, he asked to eat, according to the website Ranker, 2 pounds of bacon, a large 4-meat pizza, 4 fried chicken breasts, 2 drinks each of Mountain Dew, Pepsi, root beer, and sweet tea, 2 pints of ice cream, 5 chicken fried steaks, 2 hamburgers with bacon, fries, and a dozen garlic breadsticks with marinara on the side. That state must have had a big budget. 5 p.m. The witnesses will likely arrive at the prison. This might be family of the victims, journalists, family of the condemned, friends of the condemned, or whoever the condemned has asked to be witnesses. They will be told to try and stay quiet when they reach the witness room. Before that, they'll wait somewhere else. In most states, civilians who didn't know anyone involved will be asked to witness the execution. 6 to 8 p.m. The time of execution can vary from state to state, but it's just about always in the early evening. At this point, the prisoner will be taken to the execution room. The witnesses will soon be in the witness room. Prisoners, for the most part, will just walk right there and not give the guards any problems. In some states, this will be a 5-man team, just in case there is a struggle. But that doesn't happen often. One warden interviewed who had done 89 executions said he'd only had one prisoner that was hard to deal with. The walk to the chamber in most places is only about 10 feet, just over 3 meters. The guys would usually walk right up to the electric chair. They weren't forced by the staff. By that point, they've already accepted what will happen. A former Death Watch guard told Business Insider. Another guard in a separate interview said the same. Inmates usually act very dignified. It's a very clean procedure, there's no hustling and bustling. It's not always this way, especially if the prisoner is protesting his innocence. In 2018, the BBC reported that one man in Florida was screaming and thrashing before he was executed, screaming to everyone that they were murdering an innocent man. One warden said the first thing that catches his eye is that gurney, which is the place he's going to die. If it is lethal injection, which it often is, the prisoner is told to sit on the gurney and then lay down. There will be a tie-down team, each responsible for a part of the prisoner's body. Doctors will usually not be at the execution because it's not in line with their code of ethics, so there will be a special team to administer the drugs. This is not always easy as the veins tend to hide during this stressful time. Some of them had burnt veins from drugs, which would make the process longer and more painful, said one former warden. When the catheters are in place, the inmate will be secured again. There's about 15 minutes before the execution. Believe it or not, some inmates have got a stay, which means a call to stop the execution during these last minutes. If that doesn't happen, the witnesses are brought into the main room and the curtains are undrawn. Some inmates might make a final statement. It depends on the state, but some prisoners might be given a few minutes, and others just allowed to make a brief statement. Kentucky gives 2 minutes, but in Pennsylvania you can't talk at all, and the statement can only be written. Here are some fairly recent examples of last words. I'm ready to roll, time to get this party started. My last words will be, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Somebody needs to kill my trial attorney. I think that governor's phone is broke, he hasn't called yet." These are, of course, unusual ones, and most people will just say their goodbyes to loved ones or give an apology for what they did. At this point, the chaplain might lay a hand on the prisoner, sometimes where there's a pulse. The warden will give the signal to the executioner, and then it's time. The end of the day, the end of a life. If you've already seen the 2008 movie Bronson about Britain's so-called most notorious prisoner, don't worry. That rather theatrical piece of cinema didn't tell you much about the man, so there's so much more to see today. You might be thinking that it's coincidental that a man with such a reputation has the same name as a former Hollywood tough guy, but he wasn't called that at birth. The name was acquired during his bare-knuckle boxing days. He was actually born Michael Gordon Peterson. Yep, that doesn't sound quite as fearful. There's a lot of controversy about this man, regarding whether he should have been in prison for so long or if prison is to blame for his often crazy behavior. We discuss this and more in this episode of the Infographics Show, Britain's most notorious prisoner, Charles Bronson. As you know, he was born with the name Michael. His birthday was December 6, 1952. He spent his first few years in Wales and then moved to Luton, which isn't too far away from the capital, London. It doesn't seem that he came from a rough and tumble background, given that his father ran a conservative club for a while and his aunt and uncle were a mayor and mayoress. His aunt actually once said this about him: as a boy, he was a lovely lad. He was obviously bright and always good with children. He was gentle and mild-mannered, never a bully. He would defend the weak. He might have defended the weak, but it seems his penchant for violence and crime started early in life. After he moved up north at the age of 13, it seems that that's when trouble started. At that age, he was charged as a juvenile for stealing, and it said he was part of a gang. He didn't much enjoy school and soon left to start working at an early age. His first job came when he moved back down to Luton. This was a very short 2-week stint working in Tesco supermarket. Apparently, he was fired for attacking his manager. After this, it seems, crime became second nature to young Michael. He got in trouble for criminal damage but got off with a fine and some probation. He had lots of jobs, mostly related to labor or factory work, and we're told he enjoyed nothing more than a good night out on the town, drinking gallons of beer and getting into fistfights with the locals. Easy to do in some areas of the UK. He likely wasn't short of foes on the mean streets of Luton. One of his jobs, we're told, was a circus strongman, so he was likely a hard man to fight. He got in trouble again after crashing a stolen lorry, or a truck, into another car, but again got off with just a fine as no one was seriously hurt. At this point, he is still in his teens. Yet again, he got into trouble, and at this time aged 19, when he was involved in a smash and grab, which is basically smashing a car into a shop front and getting as much as you can. Again, he got off with just a fine and a suspended sentence. Age 20, perhaps, he got his chance to join what is sometimes called the straight and narrow, as he met a girl and got married. But apparently, she quite liked his tough guy persona, his tailored suits, and the fact that he spoke in a Cockney accent. They had a child and called him Michael Jonathan Peterson. According to the British press, the son is very private and has never spoken publicly about his notorious dad, so we can't tell you much about him. Moving on, now 22, Michael was arrested for armed robbery, and at this time the judge came down hard. He got 7 years, but prison wasn't exactly a place he liked being, it seemed. During his first stint in prison in Liverpool, he attacked 2 other prisoners, and we're told he wasn't provoked. That got him time in solitary, something he would see much more of later. He was then transferred to prison in Hull, and again had issues with guards and prisoners. They gave him sedatives to calm him down, which apparently made him very ill. He also spent more time in isolation, and he was said to be a very difficult prisoner. On one occasion, he was out of solitary, he attacked a prisoner with a glass jug, and he was convicted of unlawful wounding. Yet again, he was moved, this time to the tough Armley Jail in Leeds, a foreboding-looking place if you've ever seen one. So there he was, now serving time in what looks like a medieval castle. Even in 2018, the place is said to be the place with the highest rate of people taking their own lives, and in the press right now, it's said it's still very much an unsafe place for both prisoners and staff. Back in the 70s, it can't have been a holiday. But it seems he was too much for Armley, and he kept moving between a number of prisons, sometimes chained to the floor of the vans he traveled in. It's said if not in solitary, he would attack prisoners and guards. It's also said he incurred numerous vicious beatings from the guards after an attack. You might have seen that in the movie, which depicts these guards having to tackle him in numbers. During one time in solitary while recovering from a beating, he got divorced. We imagine this might have been a low point, but it's said that one thing that kept him going was his solitary workout routine, keeping him healthy and fearsome. His book, Solitary Fitness, which he wrote after many years inside, has sold millions of copies. Reviews are actually very positive, although people talk about how strange the book can get at times. Profits from the book, says the media, go to children's charities. The British press tells us that his strength was quite unbelievable. He once bent the cell bars with his own hands, and it's said he holds 6 world records for strength and fitness. Another unofficial record he has set is the most prison rooftop protests by any British inmates. But right now, we're still in the 70s and a long way from fame or infamy. While in prison in London, he tried to poison an inmate, and it seems that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Enough with prison, he was transferred to a psychiatric facility. But guess who he met there? 2 of Britain's most ruthless gangsters, the Kray twins. He called them the best 2 guys I ever met. That friendship didn't last long though, as he was moved back to prison. What followed was more solitary, escape attempts, attacks on prisoners that ended with lifelong scars, more attacks, and finally, when the authorities were sick and tired, he was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. He was no longer just a criminal, but mentally ill. In 1978, he was again in another special facility, but it seems he didn't much like being forced to take medication and wasn't keen on the fact that he was surrounded by some of Britain's most disturbed people. Men who would never leave the facility because they had done things to people we will not talk about. Yep, he didn't like some of these terrible men, and at one point was said to be about 5 seconds away from killing a fellow patient or prisoner who had taken the life of an innocent child. In his own words, describing the people around him at the facility, "I witnessed them running into walls, using their heads as rams. I've seen them fall unconscious doing this. There was one who just kept trying to eat himself, biting his arms, legs, and feet." He tried to kill another prisoner, and then in 1982, when still in the notorious Broadmoor, he led a rooftop protest that lasted 3 days and caused around $300,000 worth of damage. Now you can see why this guy became well known as a hard-to-deal-with prisoner. But there was a lot more to come. He hadn't even started. He led 2 more rooftop protests and also went on a hunger strike, but in some ways he found solace in writing poems, sketching, and creating cartoon strips. He even won awards for his work. It didn't stop him being violent though, just settled him down from time to time. Psychiatrists couldn't figure him out, and even though he was in a mental facility, he was never properly diagnosed. He once said, "Asylums are crazy places with crazy rules. If you're not mad when you arrive, you are when you leave." Again, he was moved from facility to prison, stabbing inmates, hitting others, more rooftop protests, more isolation, more beatings from the guards, more medicine, and perhaps his piece de resistance, he once strangled a prison governor. After that, he was not allowed out of isolation until he finished his sentence. He got out of prison in 1987 and almost immediately turned to crime. Although his first offense was quite comical, he bought a water pistol and modified it a bit, after which he forced a man at Water Pistol Point to drive him to Luton, his favorite spot. There, he started bare-knuckle fighting and earned the nickname Charles Bronson. He actually legally changed his name to this. Was this the start of a life on the outside? Not a chance. It's written that he would fight anyone and even challenged the king of bare-knuckle fighting, Lenny McLean. It seems Lenny wanted no part of him, or at least when he agreed to fight, it was too late as Bronson was back in prison. In another fight, he was challenged to go against a large Rottweiler. He killed it and said later in life that he really regretted that. It was cash in hand though. He was only out of prison months and was back inside again for armed robbery. We won't go into details, but he fought again, attacked prisoners, guards, and had more time in solitary, was moved and moved and moved, and occasionally tried to start riots. In 1989, he was attacked himself, stabbed in the back several times, but he recovered. He wouldn't tell the police anything about his attackers. In 1992, he got out for the grand total of 53 days. He was jailed but got off. Then he was arrested again for having a shotgun and conspiracy to rob. It gets crazy here, because while on the remand, he took a librarian as a hostage. While negotiating with police, he had 3 demands: an inflatable doll, a helicopter, and a cup of tea. Yep, you heard that right. He was given 8 years despite saying the gun was to blow off his own head. It wasn't the first time he had contemplated taking his own life. He was difficult again, transferred from prisons, and at times was left naked for many days on end in dark isolation. At one point, he was put in the worst spot in any prison in the UK, something called the Hannibal Cage, that had been created for another prisoner who had once killed inmates and was said to have spooned out one person's brain and eaten it. Even though at one point he attacked a governor, it's said he got much better after being allowed to interact with handicapped children. He also kept up his cartoon sketching. These were the quiet times. They didn't last long. He endured more solitary, more moves, and then in one prison he took 2 Iraqi hijackers as hostage in his cell. It's said he was going crazy after losing his father. It's also said that he told the guards if they came close he would snap off the heads of his hostages. He made his hostages tickle his feet and demanded they sing songs to him. To them, he was known as the General. He demanded a plane, machine guns, ammunition, and a cheese and pickle sandwich. It seems later he just kept asking for ice cream. In the end, he let the hostages go and another 7 years were added to his sentence. While in great physical shape, it's said that all the time in darkness and solitary had negative effects on his eyes and his social skills, and lawyers now started to get on his side. It's a pity then that he took one of them hostage. He let him go quickly though, but after one civilian worker criticized his drawings, he took him hostage too, and then started ripping up parts of the prison. What else? Well, after the millennium, he got married again, converted to Islam, changed his name and took another hostage, wrote a book, sketched a lot, and then changed his name to Charles Arthur Charlie Salvador, out of respect for his favorite artist. The movie came out and he became a household name. Until then, not many people knew about him. Thousands of people around the world started to support him, saying even though he had been a bad boy, his incarceration had just gone on too long. But he couldn't stop messing up. In 2014, he attacked another governor. That same year, his artwork went up for auction, and his 200 pieces, often dark in nature, fetched around £30,000. Bronson donated a large part of this to the brain tumor charity and Keach Hospice in Luton. Bronson said the old him was now dead, and he was born again as the artist Salvador. He created more works too, donating to other charities and one-time Oxford's homeless. He also got married to an actress in 2017, and she's hoping to see him out soon. In total, out of the 44 plus years he served, 36 of them have been in solitary confinement. sometimes without light. In 2018, it was said that he is in open prison, but will have his case reviewed in 2 years and could get out. That might not happen though, as he's got a life sentence for one of his kidnappings. That was a teacher in 1999 that he held for 2 days. The British media reports that he allegedly smothered himself in butter, age 65, and challenged the guards to a fight. We'll leave you with something he once said: "I'm a nice guy, but sometimes I lose all my senses and become nasty. That doesn't make me evil, just confused." Trees, growers of fruits, spices, and nuts, generators of shade, home to birds, squirrels, koalas, frontline soldiers in the fight against climate change? You bet! Today we're doing something a little different and talking about TeamTrees.org's mission of planting 20 million new trees by 2020, where every donation of $1 equals 1 tree. You might be asking yourself, what would planting 20 million new trees do for the planet? Let's take a look at just how huge an impact each donation on Team Trees will make. A wide variety of organisms from lichen to bees to possums call trees home, and just one single mature oak tree can be home to as many as 500 different species. The Earth is rapidly losing species. We're in the middle of a mass extinction, and without trees for them to call home, many more animals will be at risk for extinction. Many animals require trees as a place to live, to feed, and to provide protection, so planting just one tree is like building a house, feeder, and nursery all at once. Donating $20 to plant 20 trees is like building an entire animal city. Multiply that by 1 million and we're talking about a super metropolis of biodiverse animal life. Study after study shows that spending time in a grove of trees or forest can provide emotional rejuvenation. It can improve your mood, create a sense of peace while reducing stress, depression, and anger. The Japanese even have a word for this: Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. The effect of trees is not only emotional but physical. Studies have shown that being among trees reduces blood pressure as well as lessens stress-related hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. So basically, trees make you happy. Plenty of scientific research has shown that happier people commit less crimes, especially violent ones. We think a grove of even just a few trees would be pretty nice. 20 million new trees would mean potentially thousands of new groves, which means millions of people able to take regular forest baths, increasing happiness and reducing crime. You'd be a regular crime fighter all thanks to the trees you helped plant. Trees reduce air temperature through blocking sunlight and creating shade. Trees also help to cool by reflecting heat upwards from their leaves. Further cooling occurs when moisture evaporates from the surface of the leaves, just like the way your body cools down by sweating. Trees can cool down an area by a lot. And we're not talking just a couple of degrees. Urban neighborhoods with mature trees can be up to 11 degrees cooler in summer heat than neighborhoods without trees. Just think about the difference between a miserably hot 90-degree day and a warm, comfortable 79 degrees. Trees can also cool down buildings, limiting the need for air conditioning, which has the added benefit of helping to conserve energy. Studies have shown that shade from strategically planted trees can reduce the air conditioning costs of buildings by 20% to 30%. Just think, if an average home has a cooling power bill of around $100 per month in the summer, and if 10 trees were planted around that same house, then 30% could be saved. And that means 20 million trees planted around homes could save $60 million in energy costs. So if you can't donate to this particular cause, please consider planting a few trees around your house. Not only will they be a beautiful addition, but they might even save your future self some money on your power bill. Trees are ideal for use as sound barriers because they reduce sound in 2 ways. First, they absorb the sound, since thick branches and leaves are great at absorbing high-frequency noise. Secondly, trees deflect sound. When a sound hits a rigid material, it bounces back. When a sound hits flexible material such as branches, the material vibrates and the sound is transformed into other forms of energy. A thick row of trees can block as much as 15 decibels of sound. That's almost like wearing a pair of earplugs, but you have something beautiful to look at instead of uncomfortable foam in your ears. The root system of trees holds soil in place during heavy rainstorms, preventing erosion, flooding, and mudslides, keeping people and buildings safe. Trees improve water quality too, as their root systems help to filter impurities and retain water within the soil. This allows for water tables to be recharged, with less water ultimately ending up in sewers and diminishing the amount of stormwater carrying pollutants to the ocean. A single 100-foot-tall tree can take as much as 11,000 gallons of water out of the soil during its growing season, releasing the water as healthy oxygen and clean water vapor. That means 20 million trees could filter a staggering 220 billion gallons. That's enough to fill more than 300,000 Olympic swimming pools. Humans inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. Trees do exactly the opposite by absorbing and storing carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, which produces and releases oxygen as a byproduct. Excess carbon dioxide is building up in our atmosphere, strengthening the greenhouse effect and contributing to global warming. The more trees the Earth has, the more carbon dioxide is absorbed and mitigated. The amount of oxygen produced by a tree depends on several factors, including the species of tree, its health, and the ambient temperature. However, some typical calculations are that a single mature tree can absorb carbon dioxide at a rate of 48 pounds per year and release enough oxygen back into the atmosphere to support 2 humans. 1 acre of trees annually consumes the same amount of carbon dioxide equivalent to driving an average car for 26,000 miles. If we assume that an acre has roughly 300 trees, then 20 million new trees could consume the carbon dioxide equivalent of a new car driving over 1.7 billion miles annually. Last but not least, in addition to carbon dioxide, trees absorb other potentially harmful pollutants, such as sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide. The canopies of trees act as a physical filter, trapping particulates of dust, pollen, smoke, and smog. A single mature tree removes up to 2.2 pounds every year, which means 20 million could remove up to 44 million pounds. And that's not all. Studies have also shown that the dust level in the air can be as much as 75% lower on the sheltered side of a tree as compared to the windward side. No one, and we mean no one, likes dust in the air. So do yourself and your neighbors a favor and plant some trees or donate a few dollars to teamtrees.org and clean the air for yourself and generations to come. In July of 2019, a Swiss study stated that if we plant enough trees, we can stop or at least put a serious dent in climate change, which is why we're committed to helping TeamTrees.org's mission to plant 20 million new trees by 2020. The Infographics Show is getting involved, and you should too. Every donation of $1 equals a new tree planted. So become part of something huge with real benefits and show the world that the YouTube community can come together and do something incredible. Usually, waking up because you have to go to the bathroom is annoying, but on May 26, 2013, waking up and leaving his bunk to use the bathroom was a decision that saved 29-year-old Harrison Ojegba Okene's life. Through an odd twist of fate, Harrison ended up being the lone survivor of a boat sinking at sea. He can lay claim to a unique title. He's the only person in the world to have survived on the seafloor for nearly 3 days. The Gulf of Guinea in the southeast Atlantic Ocean is rich with petroleum-laden layers of sedimentary seabed. Many offshore oil rig drilling operations dot the African coast here. On May 26th, about 20 miles off of Escravos, Nigeria, in choppy seas, 3 tugboats pitched and yawed as they performed tension tow functions on a Chevron oil tanker filling up at single buoy mooring number 3. Just before 5 a.m., the tugboat Jascon 4 was caught by a large rogue wave and capsized. Because of ongoing piracy problems in the Gulf, security protocol on the tugboat was that the 12-man crew would lock themselves in their room when sleeping. Unfortunately, this rule slowed down the Jascon 4's crew when they tried to escape. The crew members had to first scramble out of their cabins, that is, except for the vessel's cook, Harrison, who had gotten up to use the bathroom in his underwear. When the tugboat keeled over and the ocean rushed in, Harrison had to force the bathroom's metal door open against the wall of water. The pressure of the water was extremely strong and Harrison was unable to follow some of his colleagues to the emergency hatch. He watched in horror as a surge overwhelmed 3 crew members and swept them out of the boat into the raging sea. Then the water pushed Harrison down a narrow hallway into another bathroom which adjoined an officer's cabin. Dazed and bruised but miraculously still alive, Harrison held on to an overturned wash basin to keep his head above water in the 4-foot square bathroom. The boat sank nearly 100 feet, eventually coming to rest upside down on the seabed. When the tugboat capsized, there was an immediate rescue operation launched with the other boats in the area and a helicopter. A diving crew quickly located the wreck and marked the location with buoys. They banged on the hull. Harrison hammered back, but they didn't hear him. As the divers weren't prepared for deep diving, they could only stay at the depth of the wreck for a limited period of time. The rescue was called off due to no evidence of survivors. After nearly a day day of being in the bathroom, Harrison got up the courage to leave his little air pocket. In pitch darkness, he swam and felt his way into the engineer's office. Miraculously, there was another air pocket here too, of about 4 feet high in Harrison's estimation. Having solved the immediate problem of having air to breathe, Harrison could focus on other concerns. The first one being that he was cold. In May, the surface temperature of the East Atlantic on average is a pleasant 81.9 degrees Fahrenheit, but Harrison was 100 feet down. Shivering, wet, and wearing only boxer shorts, Harrison faced hypothermia, or his body losing heat faster than he could produce it. Cautiously, Harrison felt his way around the cabin. He found some tools and used them to strip off wall paneling. With a mattress and the material from the wall, he was able to make a platform to sit on. This platform helped Harrison to stay afloat and lifted the upper half of his body out of the water, allowing him to reduce heat loss. Hungry, thirsty, cold, and stuck in complete darkness, Harrison was terrified. He tried to think about his family. Quite religious, whenever he felt especially scared, Harrison would pray and call on Jesus to rescue him. Over time, the seawater began to remove the skin from Harrison's tongue. He could smell something rotting. He thought it was the decomposing bodies of his former shipmates. Every small sound in the dark was magnified. The creaking of the hull, the banging of the wreckage against the walls, and most horrifically, splashing and eating noises as fishes nibbled at corpses. Meanwhile, a dive support vessel, the WWII Toucan, arrived to the area of the sinking. The parent company of the JASCON 4, West African Ventures, had hired a deep-sea salvage saturation diving team from subsea services company DCN Global to retrieve the bodies of the lost crew members. The 6 divers, deck crew, and technical staff of the WWII Toucan knew it was going to be a grueling mission. Aside from the heart-rending work of recovering the dead, the boat had sunk upside down into soft mud, stirring up fine silt and creating extremely poor visibility. Furthermore, because of the security protocols, the boat was latched from the inside. Dive Team 2 consisted of Nico van Heerden, Andre Erasmus, and Daryl Oosthuizen, with Supervisor Colby Ware topside on the ship, helping to guide the divers via a connected microphone while watching the dive through a camera worn by Nico. The team spent over an hour breaking through an external watertight door and then a second metal door to get into the sunken boat. Once inside, it was extremely disorienting, with the ceiling being on the bottom and the floor overhead. The murky water was filled with all sorts of hazards, including furniture and equipment. Slowly, painstakingly, the divers explored the boat. They'd recovered 4 corpses when Nico crawled up the stairs to the main deck. It was a tight squeeze with the diving gear on his back. He was in a small passageway getting his bearings when something suddenly reached out of the murk and touched him. Harrison had nearly given up hope when he had heard a noise that sounded like an anchor dropping. Then eventually he heard hammering on the hull of the boat. He knew it had to be divers. He banged on the wall but didn't think they heard him. Then Harrison saw the light from one of the divers' head torches as he swam through the hallway past the far end of the cabin. Unfortunately, the diver was too quick and left the area before Harrison could reach him. But then came the magical moment. You may have seen the surreal, amazing rescue footage from Nico's video when he sees what he believes is another dead body. He touches the corpse's hand, and the hand unexpectedly squeezes his. Nico has a momentary freak out as his supervisor Colby shouts through the microphone, "He's alive! He's alive!" Colby then tells Nico to comfort Harrison by patting him on the shoulder and giving him a thumbs up sign. The divers were amazed to find Harrison alive. The maximum depth for recreational diving is 130 feet. Generally, recreational divers don't stay at 100 feet for more than 20 minutes. In terms of the air pocket, the divers had reached Harrison just in time. A human inhales roughly 350 cubic feet of air every 24 hours. However, because the boat was under pressure on the ocean floor, scientists estimate that Harrison's air pocket had been compressed by a factor of about 4. If the pressurized air pocket were about 216 cubic feet, it would contain enough oxygen to keep Harrison alive for about 2.5 days. When Harrison was located, he had been underwater for about 60 hours. An additional danger came from the carbon monoxide or CO2 buildup. CO2 is fatal to humans at a concentration of about 5%. As Harrison breathed, he exhaled carbon dioxide, slowly increasing the levels of the gas in the tiny space. However, CO2 is absorbed by water, and by splashing the water inside his air pocket, Harrison inadvertently increased the water's surface area, thereby heightening the absorption of CO2 and helping to keep the gas below the lethal 5% level. The divers described Harrison as having CO2 poisoning, being short of breath and delirious when they found him. He wouldn't have lasted much longer. The divers first used hot water to warm Harrison up, then fitted him with an oxygen mask. Meanwhile, on the surface, the dive support crew was in contact with medical and diving experts, discussing how to best help the survivor. Harrison had a new problem. What divers commonly call the bends. The bends, also known as decompression sickness or caisson disease, occurs when nitrogen bubbles form in the blood as a result of changes in pressure. If Harrison ascended directly from 100 feet underwater to the surface of the ocean, the bubbles in his blood would cause, in the best case, joint pain and rashes, to the worst case, paralysis, neurological issues, cardiac arrest, or possibly even death. It was decided that Harrison would be treated as if he were one of the saturation divers coming up after a dive. Harrison spent about 20 minutes getting used to breathing through the mask. Then the divers put a diving helmet and harness onto him. They were a little worried that he would panic as they got him out of the boat and would be a danger to the dive, but Harrison continued to be cool under pressure. The team was impressed with his level demeanor. Harrison was taken from the boat and led to a diving bell, which took him to the surface. He finally arrived topside at around 7 p.m. on Tuesday, the 28th of May. Disoriented, Harrison thought that it was Sunday evening and that he had only been trapped for 12 hours. He was shocked to learn that he'd been underwater for over 2 days. From the diving bell, Harrison was moved to a decompression chamber where he stayed for another 2.5 days while his body decompressed to surface pressure. Of the 12 crew members on board the tugboat Jascon 4, divers rescued one survivor and recovered 10 of the bodies. The search for the 11th crew member had to be called off due to dangerous conditions. Harrison made a full recovery from his ordeal and returned to his hometown of Warri, Nigeria. He didn't go to the funerals of his colleagues because he feared their families' reactions. Nigerians can be very religious, but are also superstitious. Some rumors spread that Harrison saved himself through black magic. Harrison was also plagued with survivor's guilt, wondering why he was the only one to live. Since the incident, Harrison's experienced PTSD. His wife, Akpavono Kene, says he suffers nightmares. Harrison will suddenly awake, screaming and flailing, convinced that he's underwater. Harrison has since taken a cooking job on dry land and vows to never again take a position on a boat. He made a pact with God when he was at the bottom of the ocean. "When I was under the water, I told God, if you rescue me, I will never go back to the sea again. Never." One rainy day in the mid-1930s, a peculiar young officer smartly paraded up to the front of his platoon's formation and snapped into place with full military precision. Unlike the rest of his platoon, however, this particular officer was carrying an umbrella. Red in the face with anger and dripping wet in rain, the battalion adjutant immediately stormed over and demanded to know what in the blue blazes the officer was thinking carrying an umbrella to formation. Without missing a beat, the young officer simply responded, "Because it's raining, sir." John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, or as he would later be known, Mad Jack or Fighting Jack, would be immediately reprimanded for his insubordination and preposterousness. But such reprimands were nothing new for the very bored officer. Amidst the brief interlude of peace between World War I and World War II, Churchill found his military service, well, rather dull. A rare breed of man, practically born to lead others on the battlefield, Churchill itched for excitement and chaos. When life failed to provide any, he sought it out himself, and at a time when roads were mostly non-existent in India, rode his motorcycle over 1,500 miles of the Southeast Asian countryside, often crossing rivers and chasms by pushing his bike along the rails of railroad tracks while he carefully stepped across the crossbeams. To ease his peacetime boredom, Churchill also taught himself how to play the bagpipes, which at the time was not a particularly popular pastime for proper British men. But not one to half-ass anything, Churchill not only learned to play the bagpipes, he would go on to place second in the officers' class of the piping championships at Aldershot, a stunning feat considering he was the only Englishman amongst the 70 or so competitors. Bagpipes mastered, Churchill also took up a keen interest in archery and became such a proficient archer that he would go on to represent England in an international tournament. Churchill may have been a daredevil and an adrenaline junkie, but that didn't mean he disliked comfort. Quite the opposite. Not only would Churchill earn himself a reprimand for bringing an umbrella to military formation in the pouring rain, but he also was chastised for using a hot water bottle to keep warm at night in his cot, against military protocol. To bypass this minor technicality, Churchill instead used a piece of rubber tubing, which he filled with hot water. The regs, after all, forbade the use of hot water bottles, but said nothing about rubber tubes. While most military men measure their alleged toughness by their ability to suffer hardship, Churchill saw no need for such inane displays of machismo, or perhaps he was, as many sources state, bored out of his mind by peace and entertained himself by annoying his senior leadership. Whatever the truth, if anyone thought Churchill was a soft man because he preferred to stay dry in the rain and sleep in warm comfort, they would be sorely mistaken, as the world was about to find out with the outbreak of World War II. In 1939, the German army invaded Poland from one side as the Russians invaded from another. Polish defenders were caught between the two surging armies and quickly surrendered. The hostilities prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany, and at last, Churchill's long stretch of peacetime boredom came to an end, commenting that "I was back in my red coat, the country having gotten to a jam in my absence." Churchill left behind his brief peacetime life of modeling and appearing in famous films as an extra to ship out to France. However, upon arriving, Churchill was immediately disappointed. Despite German aggression against the Poles and Britain and France's declaration of war, both nations simply took up positions along the French-Maginot Line and did, well, nothing. Troops simply held their ground and generally tried not to be bored for weeks upon weeks, the lack of offensive operations being the result of Britain and France's lack of preparations for war, what historians would end up calling a slight oversight. Britain and France had completely failed to fully prepare for conflict, despite years of ratcheting German aggression and a whole lot of angry, tiny mustache chest-pounding from Adolf Hitler. Whatever the case, Churchill found himself a victim of Allied unreadiness, a situation which did not suit him at all. There was a war on, damn it, and like a puppy straining on the leash, Churchill wanted his share of it. With the Soviets invading Finland, Churchill joined a volunteer detachment of British soldiers sent to aid Finn forces. They might not be Germans, but fighting anyone who was being an international dick was better than fighting nobody, Churchill supposed. Bidding his comrades adieu, Churchill joined the Finnish detachment. But before the expedition could get all the way to Finland, it was cancelled on account of some sudden and very severe German rudeness across the entire Maginot Line. Finland would have to fend for itself against the Soviets. At last, the proper war was on. Returning to his comrades, Churchill was immediately displeased at the British Army's failure to hold its ground against the overwhelming German blitzkrieg of tens of thousands of infantry, thousands of tanks, and an equal number of fighters and bombers. Churchill and his unit were then ordered to retreat, making for Dunkirk, where rescue awaited for the overwhelmed British and French forces. And if that rescue failed, the war could come to a very sudden and unpleasant end for the Allies. More than a fair bit annoyed at having to retreat, Churchill decided to creatively reinterpret his orders, and rather than simply fall back en masse, he engaged in an aggressive campaign of guerrilla raids and counterattacks against the German forces. Leading small teams of hand-picked men, Churchill would rush roaring a battle cry into battle, holding aloft a large two-handed sword. Like some anachronistic Highlander, Churchill waded into enemy fire and on more than one occasion spitted a German soldier on his claymore. Other times, Churchill would discard his rifle in favor of his longbow, sinking barbed shafts into the chests of Germans up to 100 yards away. Rumor has it that during one battle, a German officer asked for a list of casualties and injuries, only to be told that several of the casualties had been shot with arrows. The confused and irate officer warned his junior officer not to joke around with him, only to be shown the bodies with arrows still sticking out of them. Professional soldiers always expect the unexpected in combat, but nobody expected a mad Englishman shooting arrows in the midst of the greatest industrial age war in human history. During a lull in the fighting, Mad Jack Churchill, as he was now known, was spotted by a fellow officer riding his signature motorcycle, longbow on his back, arrows sticking out of packs strapped to his body, and a German officer's cap on the motorcycle's headlamp. As Mad Jack dismounted, the officer noted a streak of blood across his ear and neck, and asked about the fresh injury. Asking for a stiff drink in return, Churchill responded that he and his men had ran into a German machine gun, and his men had screamed for him to run, but he had simply been too tired to. Churchill had thought it's simpler to destroy the machine gun nest, even after being shot through the neck. Successfully making it across the channel back to England, Churchill got wind of a new military organization being formed, called the Commandos. The request for volunteers was secretive, but promised aggressive military service, which was more than good enough for Churchill. The progenitors to Britain's modern special forces, commando service included weeks of training in demolitions, firearms, infiltration, and all manner of other topics which Churchill absolutely adored. During commando training, however, Churchill also met a woman whom he would immediately marry and remain happily married to for 55 years until his death. On December 27, 1941, Churchill had his chance to rejoin the war as the newly formed commandos assaulted the German garrison at Vågsøy in Norway. Tasked with destroying the onshore artillery in preparation for a full-scale assault, Churchill stood in the lead landing craft with bagpipes, belting out the march of the Cameron men as enemy machine guns strafed the oncoming boats. As soon as the ramps lowered, Churchill waded ashore ahead of his men, holding aloft his sword and, as one soldier put it, uttering warlike cries. A half-hour later, Churchill sent out a brief telegraph to headquarters, reading simply, "Malloy Battery and Island captured. Casualties slight. Demolitions in progress. Churchill." Churchill would go on to win several military honors, as well as more than a few battle scars. But his greatest feats of valor would not come until the autumn of 1943, leading the Allied landings at Salerno in Italy. Churchill and his commandos found themselves fighting alongside American Rangers in the town of Marina. Both Churchill's commandos and the American Rangers were not designed to fight and operate as normal line infantry, lacking much of the heavy fire support that normal infantry brings to a fight, such as heavy machine guns and mortars. Armed mostly with rifles and grenades so that they could remain mobile, the commandos and rangers found themselves at a severe disadvantage as German and Italian heavy infantry assaulted their position in waves. Though casualties were extremely high, the Allied forces beat back every assault. Growing bored of simply waiting for the Germans to come to him to get shot, Churchill decided it would be best to go where they were instead and shoot them there. Ignoring the fact that his forces were grossly outnumbered and had no heavy weapons and absolutely zero support, Churchill led a night raid against a heavily defended German position, rushing out from thick undergrowth and shouting "Commando!" Churchill and his small detachment destroyed the German position and took 136 prisoners. Churchill and one of his corporals, however, had managed to get themselves far ahead of the rest of their unit in the fighting, and suddenly heard the sound of dozens of Germans digging into fighting positions all around them in the nighttime darkness. Never one to waste a good opportunity, Churchill decided that it wouldn't do to march back to friendly lines alone, and instead unsheathed his giant sword and simply walked to the first German position, ordering the men to put their hands up in German. Perhaps thinking themselves visited by the ghost of an ancient medieval man, or simply doubting that even their bullets would touch a man with balls of steel so sturdy he waded into battle carrying a giant freaking sword. The Germans obliged and were taken prisoner. Churchill, however, wasn't done. He thought it wouldn't do for his German prisoners to be lonely, and thus decided to visit another German position. By the end of the night, Churchill and his corporal took 42 German prisoners, leading them back to the British and American lines at sword point.
Churchill would go on to explain to a senior officer that as long as you tell a German loudly and clearly what to do, if you're senior to him, he will cry "Jawohl!" and get on with it enthusiastically and efficiently, whatever the situation. That's why they make such marvelous soldiers.
A few months later, however, Churchill himself would be taken prisoner, surrounded on all sides by Germans and with just 6 men and himself left alive, and with nothing more than revolvers and a single American carbine between them. Churchill fought on until the ammunition ran out, and a mortar killed 3 of his other men and wounded another. With nothing left to shoot back with, and apparently separated from his trusty sword, Churchill pulled out his bagpipes and prepared to meet his end, playing "Will Ye No Come Back Again," until a German grenade knocked him unconscious. Churchill would be sent to a POW camp, but was quickly growing bored of not killing Germans. He hastily made an escape. Upon his recapture, he was sent to an even more well-guarded POW camp, only to escape again. Meeting up with a column of American armor, Churchill was rescued, but appalled to hear that the war was nearly over. Returning to his unit, Churchill commented, "There are still nips, aren't there?" And thus Churchill volunteered to ship off to the Pacific. Sadly for Churchill, upon his arrival, the Americans dropped their second nuclear bomb, and the Japanese quickly surrendered. A heartbroken Churchill would go on to say to a friend, "If it hadn't been for those damned Yanks, we could have kept the war going on for another 10 years. Telling another friend that the Japanese had double-crossed him by surrendering, Churchill immediately began to look for an opportunity to join the many brush wars raging in the aftermath of World War II. He got his chance in 1948 when Arab forces tried to drive the Jews from what would become Israel. Present in his full dress uniform at a battalion parade, Churchill got news that a Jewish medical convoy had been ambushed by Arab forces. Not wasting a moment, Churchill immediately rushed to their aid, still wearing full dress uniform. Boldly rushing down the middle of the road and into the teeth of the battle, Churchill commented later that "I grinned like mad from side to side, as people are less likely to shoot you if you smile at them." Churchill would go on to rescue 700 Jewish civilians and earn greater military honors for his deeds. At the end of the hostilities, Churchill then went to teach at various military schools, ending his career while serving as an instructor at the Land Air Warfare School in Australia. Giving up on its many attempts to kill him, life would let Churchill live out his days happily next to his wife until his peaceful death in 1996, leaving behind an extraordinary legacy of courage and, well, no small amount of lunacy. Best remembered for his signature claymore which he waded into battle with, Churchill once answered a general awarding him a decoration who asked about the weapon by saying, "In my opinion, sir, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." It's the closing days of the Second World War, and despite defeat being a near certainty, the German army is still fighting ferociously, forcing Allied troops to pay for every inch of territory with their blood. Just outside the Vosges Mountains, an American infantry platoon is under heavy assault by a well-coordinated and armed German advance. Several M10 tank destroyers are lending their fire to the battle on the American side, but one by one they are hit by German Panzerschrecks and anti-tank munition, forcing their crews to abandon the vehicles. Amidst the chaos, one soldier sees that his men are about to be overrun, and he immediately orders them to make a break for the woods behind them. To cover their retreat, the soldier leaps up and rushes to a burning tank destroyer, hopping atop it and manning the 50 caliber machine gun, standing alone against a horde of oncoming Germans. Just 2 years earlier, Ollie Murphy found himself being rejected for military service by first the Army and then the Navy and finally the Marine Corps. The 5' 5" would-be soldier was too short and underweight, the military doctors all said. Plus, to boot, he was too young, only 16 years old. Yet there was a war on, and the pain of Pearl Harbor was still deeply felt by Murphy and most Americans. Plus, the US had just suffered crushing defeats in the Philippines. Murphy wanted to fight, and he wasn't going to stop trying to enlist until he was allowed to. Faking his birth certificate with the help of his sister, Murphy was finally accepted into the Army on the 30th of June, 1942. Taunted for his short stature, Murphy nonetheless immediately proved a very capable soldier, earning his marksman badge with rifle component bar and expert badge with bayonet component bar. Graduating from basic training, Murphy was sent overseas to the Mediterranean theater, acting as a platoon messenger in Algeria, while the Allies trained for their upcoming assault landings on Sicily. Weeks later, Murphy found himself on a speeding landing assault craft, plowing through the stormy seas with swells several feet high. A freak summer storm had sprung up overnight, preventing the landing of paratroopers meant to strike the German defenders from behind and ease the pressure on the landing sites. The weather was so bad, however, and the sea so violent, that the German commanders relaxed their defenses, thinking no Allied commander would be insane enough to risk amphibious landings in such extreme wind and rain. Yet from out of the gloom and the howling wind, there suddenly came the thunderous booming of battleship batteries, raining death down amongst the German defensive positions. And just behind the fiery onslaught were lines of Allied landing craft, bringing 150,000 soldiers into the soft underbelly of Axis-held Europe. Murphy hit the beach with his men that day, and while on a scouting patrol came across 2 fleeing Italian officers, which he shot and killed. Having survived the violence of the initial landings though, a severe illness sidelined Murphy, and he was forced into a field hospital for a week. Rejoining his unit, he was then sent to Salerno, landing near Battipaglia, where he and 2 other soldiers were ambushed by a German unit. Their withering barrage immediately cut down one of the soldiers, leaving Murphy and another soldier alone against a squad of 5 Germans firing at them from a fortified position. Responding with hand grenades and their own machine gun fire, Murphy and his comrade killed all 5 Germans, sadly too late to save the injured soldier's life. 1 month later, Murphy joined in the assault against the Volturno Line. The southernmost line of German defenses meant to slow down the Allied assault into Italy. There, Murphy and his men repelled a counterattack by 7 German soldiers, killing 3 and taking 4 prisoners. For his leadership and excellence on the battlefield, Murphy received a promotion to sergeant, only to be promoted just 1 month later in January 1944 to staff sergeant, still only 19 years old. Hospitalized with malaria, Murphy was out of action for a week and a half before rejoining his men at the First Battle of Cisterna, a disastrous American defeat that saw the loss of over 700 U.S. Army Rangers. As U.S. forces licked their wounds, Murphy found himself taking shelter in an abandoned farmhouse along with his unit. Suddenly, a German panzer discovered their position, and Murphy crawled out alone on his belly, drawing close enough to destroy the tank with rifle grenades. For his incredible heroism, Murphy was awarded the Bronze Star with V device. Months later, Murphy found himself once more on a landing craft, being tossed around the choppy seas as he sped to shore on the south of France. The Normandy invasion had been successful, and Allied forces from a now defeated Italy would join in the retaking of France by catching the Germans between a northern and southern invasion, squeezing the Nazis back into Germany. Under heavy fire, the landing craft hit the beach, and men rushed forward to destroy the German defenders, firing down on them from fortified bunkers. As the invasion force pushed out of the beaches, Murphy and his platoon found themselves picking their way through a beautiful French vineyard, a surreal moment of peace and calm amidst the incredible violence raging all around them. However, the peace was quickly shattered as German infantry opened fire on the Americans, wounding and killing several. Murphy's squad's machine gunner had been detached from the rest of his unit and desperately in need of some heavy suppressing fire. Murphy braved a storm of bullets to retrieve the weapon and then incredibly rushed back into the fray and began returning fire, killing 2 German soldiers. Suddenly, the German fire slacked off and stopped, and 2 German soldiers left their position inside a house with their hands up, appearing to surrender. Murphy's best friend responded and approached the soldiers, ready to take them prisoner, when suddenly Germans hiding inside the house opened fire, killing him instantly. In a fit of rage, Murphy stormed the house completely alone as the Germans poured fire in his direction. Incredibly, Murphy avoided being hit and, armed with only his rifle, killed 6 Germans, wounded 2, and took 11 prisoner. For his and his men's heroism that day and in the following days, Murphy and his unit received the Presidential Unit Citation. Murphy's seemingly invulnerability, however, came to an end when on the 15th of September 1944, he was wounded by a mortar blast, shrapnel cutting deep into his heel. Just a few weeks later, though, Murphy was back in action and would earn a Silver Star for assaulting a German machine gun position, killing 4 and wounding 3. Just 3 days later, engaging the Germans at Lumay in the Clure River Valley, Murphy and his unit found themselves unable to take a heavily defended hill from their German defenders. Crawling alone forward toward the German position, where he could get a better vantage point, Murphy directed his men and their assault via radio, even while Germans rained machine gun and rifle fire down on him for over an hour. After successfully taking the hill, Murphy earned a bronze oak leaf cluster for his Silver Star and a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. Joining the assault into the heart of France, Murphy and his platoon were ambushed by German snipers on the 26th of October. Picking his way from cover to cover, Murphy managed to make his way right up to the German position, taking 2 of the soldiers prisoner, while suddenly a 3rd sniper shot him in the hip. Spinning on his attacker, Murphy leveled his rifle and put 1 round directly between the sniper's eyes. For his injury, Murphy received his first bronze oak leaf cluster for his Purple Heart, but partial loss of his hip muscle due to the removal of gangrene from the wound forced Murphy out of combat until January. By that time, though, the Allies were pushing the Germans steadily back and out of France. Joining his men at the Colmar Pocket in the Vosges Mountains near central France, Murphy and his men found themselves in the thick of some of the most brutal fighting of the war. Determined to force the Allies back into the sea, a fierce German counterattack broke on the U.S. lines like a storm. Caught out in the open, Murphy called for any fire support available to prevent the Germans overrunning their position. A detachment of M10 tank destroyers responded and immediately began engaging the Germans. However, German fire quickly began eliminating the vehicles one by one. Firing from a hastily prepared defensive position, the blast of a Panzerschreck striking an M10 just feet away rolled over Murphy. Knowing his men would be killed to the last if they remained out in the open, Murphy ordered his men to make a break for the woods behind them. Remaining at his position alone, he fired at the oncoming Germans while also directing artillery fire over the radio. Murphy knew he needed to lay down some heavy suppressing fire if his men were going to have any chance of making it to safety, but he was armed with only his M1 rifle. That's when Murphy spotted the 50 caliber machine gun atop the destroyed M10, and ignoring the flames, smoke, and incoming German fire all around him, Murphy made a mad dash for the burning wreck and crawled atop it, manning the heavy machine gun and laying down a withering barrage of fire at the oncoming Germans. For over an hour, Murphy stayed atop the burning vehicle, returning fire against the Germans and advancing vehicles. The mighty 50 caliber machine gun, nicknamed Deuce by US forces, belched out high-speed death, shredding even the armor of the German vehicles. Wounded in both legs and finally out of ammunition after over 60 minutes of fighting, Murphy finally left the burning wreck and crawled his way back to his men in the woods behind him. Having killed and wounded 50 Germans and knocking out several German vehicles, Murphy ignored the wounds to his legs and led his men in an assault to repel the German counterattack, pushing the enemy back and securing the US position.
On guard against a second counterattack, Murphy refused to be evacuated to a field hospital and remained with his men as his wounds were treated. For his heroism that day, Murphy was awarded the U.S. military's highest decoration, the Medal of Honor, given only in the most extreme cases of gallantry and heroism. His wounds proved to be too great to rejoin the fighting this time, however, and Murphy was moved from the front lines to regimental headquarters to act as an Army liaison officer, a well-deserved rest for an incredible soldier. Audie Murphy would ultimately become one of the most highly decorated soldiers in U.S. history, and even earned several awards and citations from the French and Belgian governments for heroism. Unable to continue service due to his injuries, Audie left the military at the end of the war and began a very successful career as a Hollywood actor, starring in several films featuring his own exploits in combat. Sadly, Murphy would go on to be killed in a plane crash on the 28th of May 1971, though his body would be interred in Arlington National Cemetery, where it remains one of the most visited graves. In a field of bamboo and tall grass, the wind picks up and sways the long grasses for a few moments. In those precious moments, an American sniper, dressed head to toe in a camouflage ghillie suit, inches forward a few centimeters. When the wind dies, he stops dead in his tracks and will not move forward again until there's a fresh breeze. If no wind comes, though, he resolves himself to continue toward his target, a mile and a half away, by crawling at the incredible rate of 12 inches an hour. His moves are so slow and methodical that even the local wildlife fails to spot him, and deer feed directly in front of and around him. A deadly viper slithers past and over the American soldier, completely oblivious to the sniper's presence. 4 days later, his agonizingly slow crawl will be complete, and his high-value target, a North Vietnamese general, will be dead. A single round through his chest. Compliments of the White Feather, Carlos Hathcock, the legendary Vietnam War sniper. Carlos Hathcock grew up learning how to shoot and dreamed of being a U.S. Marine his entire life. Hearing of the heroic tales of valor performed by American Marines in places such as Okinawa, Midway, and Guadalcanal, at just 17 years old, he joined the U.S. Marines, and in 1965, 6 years later, he won the Wimbledon Cup Shooting Championship, designating as one of the top marksmen in the United States. In 1965, President Johnson ordered ground troops to Vietnam and signaled the start of the American ground war against the North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong allies. A year later, Hathcock was deployed to Vietnam, where he would serve as a military policeman, but upon arriving, he immediately volunteered for combat duty. Given his incredible marksmanship, he was transferred to the 1st Marine Sniper Platoon, at the time stationed at Hill 55 south of Da Nang. So near the front lines, Hathcock would very quickly put his elite shooting skills to use, and he even went so far as to wear a white feather on his bush hat so as to dare the North Vietnamese to spot him, a move that would earn him his lifelong nickname. Hathcock was soon dispatching enemy snipers, and his preferred time to hunt was sunrise and sundown. As he'd go on to explain later, first light and last light are the best times. In the morning, they're going out after a good night's rest, smoking, laughing. When they come back in the evenings, they're tired, lollygagging, and not paying attention to detail. Hathcock would take advantage of the drop in the enemy's guard during these crucial hours to great effect, scoring 93 confirmed kills and over 300 unconfirmed kills. His skills soon made him a unit trainer, and he started training other snipers on how to move silently through the thick jungle, marksmanship skills, and the all-important art of camouflage. His skills would soon be put to the ultimate test when a top-secret mission came down the pipe, and Hathcock volunteered for it, remarking that he knew nothing about the details except that it was extremely dangerous and extremely important. That mission turned out to be the elimination of a North Vietnamese Army general, an all-important link in the command and control chain of the North Vietnamese Army, which had so far eluded capture or destruction. All the Americans had to go on was some rough intel that said the general was safely tucked away in a large North Vietnamese encampment, though they didn't know where exactly. Hathcock's job would be to do what platoons of infantry and squadrons of strike aircraft couldn't do: sneak up to the encampment, locate the general, and eliminate him. For days, he hiked through the thick bush in the direction of the encampment, avoiding North Vietnamese patrols the entire way. This would be a solo mission. He turned down a spotter, fearing that any additional soldiers accompanying him would only increase the odds of discovery. Deep down inside, the mission felt like a suicide mission, and Hathcock did not want to endanger fellow Marines if he could help it. At last, Hathcock arrived to the target area, and here he had to make a choice. Thick woods surrounded the camp on 3 sides, and would be the most obvious approach for a sniper, as it gave the best cover and concealment. However, that was exactly why Hathcock opted not to make his approach from the thick woods. It would be the most expected avenue of attack, and if he made his shot, it would be directly where enemy forces would head trying to flush him out. Instead, Hathcock opted to approach the camp from a different direction, an area of grassland that offered some cover in the form of bamboo shoots and tall grasses, but in many places offered little to no cover as the grass thinned. To a casual observer, the fourth approach was completely suicidal, but Hathcock was confident in his abilities to remain undetected. He would need to move in to at least 700 yards to make his shot, and that would mean that he needed to cross over 1,500 yards of open ground to get into a good shooting position. To do this, Hathcock stashed most of his equipment and loaded himself only with several canteens of water, his rifle, and a few rounds of ammunition. Then he began to low crawl to his objective using a technique he called worming, which saw him move forward at the painfully slow rate of just inches every hour. This would make his movements so impossibly slow that they would be all but imperceptible to the enemy. Hathcock covered his full body in a ghillie suit, which would seem to be nothing more than another mound of grass, and it would take someone with a photographic memory to notice the incredibly gradual change in the landscape as he crawled forward. For 4 days and 3 nights, Carlos went without food or sleep, inching ever closer. Even animals were unaware of his presence, with wild boar and deer grazing just inches away. At one point, a deadly viper slithered next to him and over him. A single bite enough to kill him in seconds. Hathcock simply froze and let the viper pass on, then continued on his own way. As he neared the camp, Hathcock began penetrating the outer defenses. Patrols of enemy soldiers walked by just a few feet away from him, completely unaware of the sniper's presence, and at one point a soldier nearly tripped over him. Finally, he crawled between 2 heavy machine gun positions and changed his crawling technique, so that now he was crawling on his side so as to leave an even smaller trail behind him. Then, finally, on the 4th day, the general stepped out into his front porch and yawned. A second later, Hathcock's bullet had pierced his heart. The camp erupted in alarms, and all the soldiers rushed to the thickly wooded tree lines, ringing the camp, searching for Hathcock for 3 days. Meanwhile, Hathcock simply crawled back home the way he had come, completely clear of any enemy activity. Hathcock's second most famous kill would be his showdown against a Viet Cong commander known as Apache. A sniper himself, Apache had earned her nickname for scalping American POWs and for her brutality as an interrogator. An extremely sadistic woman, she took great pleasure in torturing American soldiers, and in November of 1966, Hathcock found himself in her backyard. Earlier that month, the Apache had captured a young Marine private and then tortured him for a day and a half within earshot of his own unit. Hathcock was also there, and he could hear the screams from the soldier as the Apache skinned the private alive, cut off his eyelids, tore out his fingernails, and then finally castrated him with a knife. The soldier was then released to crawl back to his unit, but though Hathcock attempted to save him, the young private ended up dying in the bush. Hathcock swore right then and there that he would kill Apache. He and his spotter hit the thick bush and began moving to locate Apache and her unit of elite snipers. The game was a deadly one. Not only was Apache a very skilled sharpshooter, but so were all the men under her command. Yet it would be Apache who would make the fatal mistake when one day her unit popped out of the thick jungle and onto a trail for just a moment. Apache squatted so she could pee, though her soldiers urged her to get back up and keep moving. At that very moment, Hathcock's bullet dropped her from 700 yards away, and as she lay dying, he put a second round through her just for good measure. By this time, Hathcock's reputation had grown to a legendary status, and the North Vietnamese had taken note. American snipers were very hated by the Vietnamese due to their deadly efficiency, and bounties ranging from $8 to $2,000 were placed on the heads of American snipers. Yet Hathcock broke all records with an incredible bounty of $30,000 to whoever could kill him. Many Vietnamese snipers tried to collect, and Hathcock killed them all. One Vietnamese sniper with a legendary reputation of his own was eventually sent to dispatch Hathcock, a soldier by the name of the Cobra. The Cobra had kills as impressive as Hathcock, often striking targets deep inside American camps and then disappearing into the jungle. Perhaps as a warning to Hathcock of his arrival, the Cobra struck at the camp he was staying at and killed a gunnery sergeant. Hathcock watched the man die and swore right then and there that he would eliminate the Cobra. Baiting Hathcock into a fight, the Cobra began to kill many Marines around the encampment over the following few days. Hathcock and his partner took off into the jungle after the Cobra,
And for days, the three men played a deadly game of cat and mouse. At one point, Hathcock made a nearly fatal mistake and leaned against a rotted tree for support. But the rot had eaten through the tree and Hathcock fell over, giving himself away. The cobra immediately fired and struck Hathcock's partner's canteen, making the man believe that he'd been hit due to the warm liquid spreading down his leg. Continuing their deadly pursuit, Hathcock managed to work around to the cobra's position, forcing the Vietnamese soldier to move to Hathcock's old position. With the sun dropping in the sky, this put the cobra in a very perilous position. And sure enough, as Hathcock scanned the jungle in front of him, he saw the telltale glint of sunlight off a rifle scope. Without hesitating, Hathcock squeezed the trigger. The cobra was dead. As Hathcock and his partner made their way to the corpse, they were shocked to discover that Hathcock's bullet had actually traveled cleanly through the rifle scope and into the cobra's eye. So accurate a shot that the bullet didn't even graze the sides of the scope. This was only possible though if the cobra had been aiming directly at Hathcock at the same time that Hathcock was aiming at him, meaning that Hathcock had cheated death by fractions of a second, being just a hair faster on the trigger than the cobra. In 1969, Hathcock's time in Vietnam would come to an end when a vehicle he was riding in struck a landmine. Hathcock was struck unconscious briefly, and when he came to, he started helping to pull wounded Marines out of the burning vehicle, receiving third-degree burns over large parts of his body. With his sniper career over, Hathcock established the Marine Sniper School at Quantico, where he dedicated the rest of his career to teaching Marines how to become deadly snipers. He would go on to die in 1999 at the age of 56 from multiple sclerosis, the disease managing to do what the Vietnamese never could. You wake up one day and feel a bit groggy. The last thing you remember is flying out to Eastern Europe and having a great time sightseeing. And then there's some vague memories of a drug deal gone south with a bunch of Russian gangsters and their leader smiling sinisterly while saying, "Perhaps it's time our friend here have a dirt nap." He laughed, his gangsters laughed, and what you originally thought was a poor use of American idioms turned out to be quite literal. Now you're 6 feet underground and stuck inside a coffin. How are you going to get out of this one? Being buried alive is a pretty common fear, and in 2018, a shocking 15% of people buried at a cemetery were in fact buried alive by mistake. Just kidding. We made that up just to panic our more claustrophobic fans, who should actually feel a lot better, knowing that being buried alive is so rare that there's no official stat for how often it happens. Of course, it has happened, and back in the 1800s, the fear was so prevalent that special coffins were made available which came with a length of string tied to a bell above the grave. If someone happened to find they'd been pronounced dead prematurely, all they would have to do is ring the bell. Again, though, we weren't able to find any verified claims of this ever actually happening. But what if it did happen to you? First, we're going to be straight up with you and let you know that freeing yourself is going to take a lot of luck and be incredibly difficult. So difficult, in fact, that right this very second, millions of people could very well be trying to desperately claw their way to freedom from an early grave only to die of asphyxiation. So who knows, maybe 15% of people really are buried alive. I mean, we researched it and there's no official way of checking if a buried corpse is, an actual corpse. If your family opted for embalming though, then you have nothing to worry about, because if you weren't dead before the mortician got his hands on you, you definitely are after he suctions out all your blood and replaces it with a witch's brew of chemicals. Embalming, however, is not legally mandated, and instead your family could ask that you be refrigerated until the funeral service. This is a cheaper alternative to embalming and will help keep you crisp and semi-fresh, so your family has a chance to say goodbye without you looking like a Walking Dead extra. If you've seen our previous episode on the man who survived being frozen for 12 hours, then you're already aware that chilling a body can actually help keep it alive. The chilling can slow your cellular activity to the point that you require very little oxygen, and your heart can beat very, very sparingly and still keep you alive. Odds are, though, that if you're buried alive, then you've probably been involved in some shady business with the Russian mob, who coincidentally find it a great laugh to bury their enemies alive inside coffins and listen to them try to claw their way out. In this case, believe it or not, you have a very thin chance of survival. So what can you do? Step 1. Calm down. You ever been told to calm down in the middle of a fight? Remember how it only made you a lot angrier? Well, this time you're gonna have to actually calm down. Waking up inside a coffin is going to be a pretty traumatic and terrifying experience, and in all honesty, we wouldn't blame you for freaking out. But whatever you do,
don't. That's because when you're being hysterical with a boyfriend or girlfriend and get told to calm down, you can afford to completely ignore the advice, thanks to all the free oxygen you're gulping down in your outrage. Inside a buried coffin, though, you're working on a very strict oxygen budget. And if you woke up inside the coffin, then that means you've been lazily sleeping for who knows how long and gulping down oxygen by the mouthfuls the entire time. Freaking out is only going to increase your oxygen intake and do you very little good. It's time to clear your mind and try meditating. Focus on slowing your breathing and stay in control of your emotions. Step 2. Take inventory. This might sound like a no-brainer, but once you've calmed down, check the inside of your coffin. Maybe you have a pocket knife, that would be great, or a belt buckle, or literally anything else that's very hard and rigid. You could use a belt buckle to tap rhythmically on the lid of your coffin and hope that someone above can hear you. If you were accidentally buried alive, then there's a good chance there's still someone up above paying their last respects or putting the finishing touches on your grave. If you have a pocket knife, it's going to come in handy for trying to break your way out of the coffin. Increasingly, though, people are being buried with cell phones, either by accident or on purpose, so that loved ones can call the corpse. Yeah, we also don't get that one, but hey, to each their own. If you happen to have a cell phone on you, then try dialing out. There's a small chance you'll have reception. If your carrier is T-Mobile, then forget it. You're screwed. Step 3. Prepare to bust out. Okay, you have no cell phone or you foolishly opted for a contract with T-Mobile, which means you have no reception inside your coffin or anywhere else, really. It's time to get out. First, let's just say that if you've been buried in a steel-lined coffin, then forget it, it's over for you. Remember that pocket knife? You have 2 choices here, the fast way out or slow, lingering asphyxiation. But let's say you got buried in a much cheaper wooden coffin, or a budget model made out of very rigid cardboard. This is one time you're going to be grateful to your family for being a bunch of cheapskates. What you're going to want to do is make a hole in the coffin through which you'll crawl out. But first, you have to protect your ability to breathe. Take your shirt and lift it up over your head so that it covers your head, like when 2 hockey players get into a fight. This will make a hood that your head fits inside of and will keep dirt out and help you have some oxygen as you crawl upwards. Step 4. Bust out and take revenge on the living. Alright, you've got your shirt over your head to help you maintain some breathing air as you claw your way to freedom through several feet of dirt. Or at least so you look hilariously ridiculous when they eventually dig you up a few years later. Now you want to feel for the center of the lid of your coffin. This will be the weakest point structurally because science. It'll be difficult in the cramped spaces, but you want to start hammering away at this point. And while you won't be able to actually bust out, you can flex the lid enough that hopefully the weight of the dirt above it will crack it. Once you've accomplished this, tear away at the wood or heavy cardboard and push all the incoming dirt to the bottom of your coffin, while trying to wriggle your body so that your head doesn't get stuck in place. You're going to have to make like a worm and wriggle continuously to push the dirt aside and hopefully down while widening the opening in the lid. In time, you should be able to have made a large enough hole that you can start making your way upwards. And this is actually the easy part. Since you were recently buried, then all that dirt is going to be very loose and pretty easy to dig through. Of course, it's all going to be compacting your little bubble of air supply, so you're going to have to move fast. Once you've busted out, take a well-deserved breath of fresh air. Now you're free to freak out all you want. Breaking free completely will take some time, but with enough wriggling, you should eventually manage to get your arms loose, and then you can simply pull yourself up to freedom. You've done it. You've come back from the grave, like a completely predictable twist on AMC's The Walking Dead. Now it's time to get a second lease on life, or at the very least, to change your phone carriers. Welcome to another video when we pit someone or something that has extraordinary strength and abilities against a regular Joe, such as yourself. Today we're talking about Thanos, one of the most formidable bad boys in the Marvel Universe. He first showed his ugly face in the comic The Invincible Iron Man number 55, and has since been a fairly regular fixture. You might also have seen him in a number of Marvel movies, and he'll appear in the upcoming Avengers Endgame. The creator of this villain, Jim Starlin, quite amusingly once said he got the idea while studying psychology and anger management. Yep, Thanos sure has a problem controlling his rage. But now let's have a look at his backstory before we get into the actual fight. Indeed, if you look at Marvel's Cinematic Universe fan site, you'll see that he would have been interesting work for any psychologist. He's described as being powerful, extremist, genocidal, psychopathic, violent, and tyrannical. Also known as the Dark Lord, Mad Titan, or even the most powerful being in the universe. He's understandably a bit of a handful. He was born on Titan, one of many of Saturn's
Saturn's moons. Just so you know, according to NASA, Saturn has 62 confirmed moons, but a few more could be added to that list soon. Titan is special as it has its own atmosphere. Thanos is the son of Eternals, Ars and Suisan, and he has a brother called Eros. He carries something called the Deviance gene, and this somewhat helped shape his appearance. After his birth, his mother was so taken aback by his appearance that she tried to kill him. The father prevented this from happening, but perhaps some of Thanos' darker aspects can be explained by how he was treated and how he looked. He was friendly enough during his early days in school, but kept to himself and mainly just hung out with his brother and his pets. But then, as he got older, he became fascinated with death and some aspects of nihilism, a philosophical belief that life has no inherent value, purpose, or higher meaning. But then he finds meaning later in life when he becomes obsessed with Mistress Death, the personification of death itself. Chasing after her is his raison d'etre, and there is nothing he wouldn't do for her. We might also add that Thanos was not always portrayed as an out-and-out villain. You see, when he was living on Titan, there were way too many people and just not enough resources. Thanos had the idea just to kill half the people and the problem would be solved. That didn't go down well with his people, of course. He didn't perform the Great Call, and then he was proved right. Titan was overrun and devastated, and the Titan people almost became extinct. Over his long history, the story has changed many times, but you can read in the comics how Mistress Death got Thanos to wipe out half the universe. She said there were too many living people and not enough dead people, and asked him to get the job done. Thanos believed this to be true, having seen what happened on his own planet. He thought sending off half the universe to an early grave would be an act of love in some ways. We should add that Mistress Death was also around from time to time to bring him back from what seemed like certain death. Thanos wants to exterminate half the universe because he thinks he's doing a good thing. That's based on his belief that there are not enough resources to go around. The simple solution is to just get rid of many beings. He commands armies and he has many followers. He seeks to find the Infinity Stone so he can succeed in his plan. If you don't already know, the stones are 6 elemental crystals that hold an important aspect of the universe. These stones were the creation of the cosmic entities, and they each hold immense power. So for many years, Thanos goes looking for these stones, and that gets him into a lot of trouble, while often making alliances on the way. He becomes a very feared tyrant because if he came to your planet, he might see to it that he left with half the population dead. It would be an understatement to say Thanos is a hard man to keep down. He comes up against the best there are, including head-to-head with Thor, the Avengers, the Masters of the Mystic Arts, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and the nation of Wakanda. He eventually wins in his last big fight, and with a snap of his fingers, the universe is depopulated. He has no misgivings, sounding at times like German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche once said, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." Thanos once uttered the dictum, "Flesh is weak. Weakness must be cast aside for the sake of power." For Thanos, power and sometimes ruthlessness had to be embraced for the greater good. Destruction was as necessary as creation. He even had his adopted daughters, Nebula and Gamora, fight, and when Nebula lost, he removed part of her body because he said this would make her stronger. So did this crazy, tough-loving tyrant ever lose a fight? Well, as some of you might know, he once came up against the forces of Wakanda, who were backed up by some of the members of the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy, and he makes fairly easy work of them. This ends with the mad tyrant putting the 6th and last stone in the gauntlet and harnessing the power of the universe, thus making him omnipotent. As we said, the end product is Thanos achieving what he always wanted to do, get rid of half the universe. He saw this as imperative to saving the other half, but we might ask if there was an alternative solution. Thanos didn't seem to think so, kind of hailing himself as an unsung hero, once saying, "The hardest choices require the strongest wills." That's basically saying, it's a dirty job, but someone has to do it. Thanos incurred an injury, but he seemed happy enough after killing half of all beings. What we usually see in such stories is the bad guy losing, but Thanos proved he had almost unstoppable power. But if you go back through all the comics, Thanos had his behind handed to him on many occasions. In 2005, you might have seen him losing a fight to Squirrel Girl, while Drax the Destroyer once killed him by ripping out his heart. Adam Warlock once turned him into stone, and that held him back for a while. But as we said, when you have Mistress Death in your corner, there are often ways of getting resurrected. He's also been killed as a clone and even as a zombie Thanos, and on many other occasions when his anger and nihilism got the better of him. What is so often his downfall is his devotion to Mistress Death, and she seems at times to enjoy playing with his sometimes misguided mind and fickle heart. Thanos Thanos might be the strongest of them all, but he has an Achilles heel, his heart and ego. When people were asked how Thanos might be defeated in upcoming movies, seeing as he laid so many people to waste in the last one, a few folks had some ideas. At this point, we have an already almost unbeatable villain who now has been made even stronger with cosmic cubes and infinity stones. He's been made to look like he can't lose. But as we know, everyone loses sometimes. The closest we saw him to being badly hurt in the movies was when Thor hit him in the chest with his Stormbreaker. We at least know that he has a weakness, and perhaps, as some pundits have said, someone will rustle up some kind of weapon in the upcoming movie, and that weapon will be the end of Thanos. After all, everything so far has been thrown at Thanos and nothing worked. Perhaps it will take some magic from the tool makers, and who knows what will be created. We looked at what people were saying on forums about how to beat Thanos, and some of the answers were amusing. One person said the Avengers will have to appeal to Thanos' rather large ego, taunting him to fight them without using all those powerful stones. Perhaps Thanos might just do it to prove he can win, but we doubt this will happen. There's also the fact that the Infinity Gauntlet might not always wield the power that was required to wipe out half the universe. Without its full power and the fact that he was hurt, this might mean he could be defeated. As many others have said, why didn't Thor just aim for the head and not the chest? Others are not so positive, with one person writing, "The Avengers essentially cannot beat Thanos with the gauntlet. He kills half the universe, regardless of power, with a mere thought. He could literally end reality with the gauntlet. And with that in mind, how could you beat Thanos?" Well, as you don't have superpowers and you are up against a person that can destroy just about everything in the universe, this is not going to be an easy fight. In fact, let's just forget about having a traditional fight and think about heart, mind, ego, and hubris. So let's have a look at the name Thanos and his brother Eros. If you know your Greek mythology, you'll know that there were two characters with a similar name and the same name. The first was Thanatos, the personification of death. The second was Eros, the god of love and desire. The Marvel comics just based their characters' names on ancient Greek characters. We might also note that psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud said that people are controlled by both a death drive, Thanatos, a drive toward ultimate destruction, but also a drive to create, which was based on Eros. Okay, so if we're sticking with Greek myths, we might acknowledge that Thanos is lacking in the Eros department. He's been devoted to Mistress Death, but that's almost like looking in a mirror. Perhaps your only chance of defeating Thanos is to teach him to love, to show him love. It's a course of action that hasn't been taken in the movies. But as a mere human, one of your only chances of not losing against this thing is by changing his very reason for living. You must transform the nihilist through your wise words and make him become an idealist, a believer in the higher power of love. That might, of course, just get you squished into a ball and thrown off the edge of a cliff. There have been some angry people on the planet that seemed had no spots to change. The hate and fury is in the blood, in the very marrow of the bones. Okay, so what's next? In that case, as a mere human, you must try and trick Thanos. We can look at Greek mythology again and think about the word hubris. When we talk about hubris now, we mean arrogance, overconfidence, too much pride, a boastful ego, which more often than not ends with a downfall. This could be good news for you, and let's not forget that in mythologies, wily humans have beaten giants in the past. Now, the one thing you have going for you in your fight with Thanos is the fact that his arrogance would be so high after beating everyone and fulfilling his objectives that you could not possibly be a threat to him. Now, you must appeal to his ego, and it's likely he'll let you close because, as we said, you could not possibly hurt him in his eyes. You become his friend and tell him you're devoted to him. This is a great advantage, since you might be able to get so close you could get your hands on the Infinity Gauntlet. Okay, so that might vaporize you, but it might not. Remember that Doctor Strange, a human, has touched one of the great stones. Get your hands on this, and you might have the power of the universe. You were like a Trojan horse. Your feebleness made Thanos put his guard down, and because you stroked his ego, he took a liking to you. Then, wham! You end his life just as he ended millions of others. Believe it or not, there's a fairly long list of people who have survived their executions. We might look at the case of William Duell, a 17-year-old English boy who was hanged in 1740 in London and then came back to life as he was about to be dissected. He was later exiled to North America. Then you had John Babacombe Lee, another Englishman nicknamed the man they couldn't hang, after surviving 3 executions. More recently, you have the case of Rommel Broom, an American man sentenced to death by lethal injection. He survived that.
ended up writing a book called Survivor on Death Row, but it seems he spoke too early, as he's scheduled for another execution in 2020. But today we'll talk about one of the best-known survivor stories in this episode of the Infographics Show, death row inmate who survived his own execution. As we've said, a handful of people have survived their executions. You can read quite recent cases too, such as American inmate Doyle Lee Ham, who was said to have experienced torturous and traumatic hours in the execution chamber before staff admitted that they had failed. The US media reported in 2017 that a man called Alva Campbell became the third man to survive an execution in the country in recent decades, and that was just a matter of the execution team not being able to find a vein in which to inject the lethal drugs. But perhaps the tale we're about to tell you now is the most moving, as the person that survived was only 17 years old. It's also the first case of someone surviving the electric chair in the USA. If you've seen our show on Old Sparky, you'll know that executions in the early days could certainly be horrific to watch, but eventually the inmates succumbed to the shock. That was not the case for 17-year-old Willie Francis. Let's have a look at what events led to him ending up in the chair. Francis was a young, poor African-American in 1946, and at the time of his lucky escape, many people believed that the hand of God had interrupted this macabre spectacle of official murder. For one thing, he was just so young, and a lot of people decreed the execution of a boy not yet a man. And another thing was the fact that the American justice system at the time could have been said to be harsh for certain people of certain races and certain social standing. He lived in a place called St. Martinville, located in southwestern Louisiana. You can read articles about this place in the 40s, with one saying that the town had two sections, one for the white people and the other for the colored. The white tended to their own business and the colored tend to theirs. Yes, this was a time when racism was pervasive in some parts of the US, and despite the backwards attitudes of some people, there was a lot of support for young Willie when he was condemned to death. After the botched execution attempt, Francis wrote from his prison cell. "A lot of people write me to ask me to tell them something about what I did when I was young. I'm only 18 now, so I guess they mean when I was very young. But what had he done?" One of 13 children, Francis said life was hard as a kid, but he wrote he had fond memories of the hard-knock life, playing baseball with a broomstick handle, and going out with friends causing mischief. When he got older, he was given a job by a man called Andrew Thomas. Thomas owned the local drugstore, hiring Francis to do errands and keep the store tidy. They apparently got along, and Francis was called a nice boy and cooperative by folks who visited the store. He was, however, called illiterate by some, or at least close to that. Others said he was slow, but later when Francis was writing from his prison cell, it was proven that he could not just write, but express himself in a deep and meaningful way. We're telling you this because this case was very controversial, and at the time and for years after, people tried to understand why this seemingly nice kid committed a murder. That murder was of the drugstore owner, Thomas. When her son was convicted of slaying his boss, the mother told the press, "There wasn't no bad in him, I just don't understand." Quite a few people thought that this young boy, perhaps somewhat mentally challenged, had admitted guilt to something he didn't do, the murder of Andrew Thomas, described as a handsome, educated bachelor with his own successful business. He was killed at his home during that night of November 7th, 1944. His body was discovered the next day, splayed on the floor near the house steps. Two witnesses, Alvin and Ida Van Brocklin, had said that they heard gunshots in the night. They didn't see who did the firing though. It was later said that Thomas had been dining with friends and upon returning home had been met by a gunman who unloaded 5 bullets in him. 2 hit him in the back, 2 in his left side, and 1 went right through his eye. It said his pockets had been emptied, prompting police to say the reason for the murder was robbery. Rumors spread around town. It said he was quite the ladies' man, and many speculated he had been killed by one of those ladies' husbands or lovers. For months, people believed this to be the case. Sometime later, police were looking for a drug dealer, and it said that Willie Francis just happened to see the police. He wasn't dealing drugs, but it said that when he saw the 2 white police officers running his way, he just took off out of fright. That was a mistake, as running made the police think that he was guilty of something. Later, Francis was interviewed by cops at the police station. They said he seemed frightened and he stuttered a lot, but it turned out that Francis had stuttered his whole life. The cops didn't think that they had captured a drug dealer that they had been looking for, but guess what they found on Francis? They found Andrew Thomas's wallet and identification card. That's what they said anyway. It said that within 3 to 5 minutes, the police got a full confession for the murder of Thomas. They also managed to get a confession for an unrelated assault and robbery in another town. The facts cops did this in a few minutes, and the fact that the boy was said to be somewhat slow would compel people to ask if the interrogation and subsequent confessions were perhaps a part of a setup. Francis was questioned without a lawyer, without any advice, without any family member or friend being present. The confession read, I, Willie Francis, now 16 years old, I stole the gun from Mr. Ogassi at St. Martinville, Louisiana, and kill Andrew Thomas November 9, 1944. Or about that time at St. Martinville, Louisiana. It was a secret about me and him. I took a black purse with card 1280182 in it, $4 in it. He wrote a second confession the next day. This one contained more details about how many shots had been fired and where the body was found. As for the trial, it said Francis's lawyers were inept. One writer says they never questioned for indictment, nor did they make a motion for a change of venue, despite the widespread publicity about the murder of a beloved white member of a small community by a black youth. The 12 white jurors found him guilty, and he was to be executed. Francis' lawyers never challenged the verdict. By the way, Francis has pleaded not guilty. The jury never heard any argument pertaining to the possibility of a forced confession or that evidence could have been planted. The confession itself was good enough for him to be convicted. Many people in the town thought that something smelled funny, as did many others across the U.S. The local press wrote, quote, "Throughout the trial, the Negro was uninterested and showed very little emotion," unquote. Francis wrote that he was concerned that he might act like a crybaby on the day of his execution, but was relieved to hear that the actual execution would only tickle. On May 3, 1946, he had his head shaved and prepared to have 2,500 volts of electricity flow through him. On his cell wall, it was discovered that he had written the words, "Of course I am not a killer." Police never did have a motive for the murder, nor any substantial evidence other than the confession of a slow 16-year-old boy. He was taken to Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola to be put in the chair nicknamed Gruesome Gertie. The lever was pulled, and this is how Francis later described the feeling. "I couldn't stop the jumping. If that was tickling, it sure was a funny kind. I thought for a minute I was going to knock the chair over. Then I was all right. I thought I was dead." Other reports state that he shouted, take it off," as the executioners tried to give him a second round of shocks. It's said that after the failed attempt, he wasn't even injured, but he said he felt kind of dizzy. Some people said this was a miracle and a righteous one, as they didn't believe that he was guilty nor had a fair trial. Louisiana's Governor James Davis then said in 6 days they would send him to the chair again. That didn't happen, and much of America got behind the young man. He once wrote, "I felt just like a movie star. I didn't have any idea I had so many friends." He also later described how his execution felt and something he called the chair. He wrote, "You feel like you got a mouthful of cold peanut butter, and you see little blue and pink and green speckles, the kind that shines in a rooster's tail." What ensued were many months of legal arguments. Not only did some people believe he wasn't even, but lawyers now argued that to subject a person to a second execution was cruel and unusual punishment. Prosecution lawyers argued against that, stating the first attempt had not worked at all and he had not been hurt. But the evidence supporting this in hindsight seems pretty weak. The court also heard that the botch was just an accident, and such accidents happen for which no man is to blame. That meant no one was at fault, and there should be another execution. We might also note that later the state was petitioned, with lawyers stating this about the botched execution. The scene was a disgraceful and inhuman exhibition, that as soon as the switch controlling the current was taken off, the drunken executioner cursed Francis and told him he would be back to finish electrocuting him. And if the electricity did not kill him, he would kill him with a rock. The drunken men in charge that night were accused of being sadistic, not giving Francis the full shock because they wanted to torture him. He was then returned to the chair on May 9, 1947, and this time he didn't survive. He was just 18 years old. If anything positive came out of all of this, it's the fact that the justice system was exposed for not supporting Francis in the first place. This poor black boy may or may not have killed his boss, but he certainly wasn't protected as he should have been by the American justice system. Many Americans of all colors saw and criticized what had happened. In the spring of 2009, 72-year-old Prox Sanchez was having trouble hearing and also experiencing earaches. A hearing specialist sent him to get an MRI. Just after the scan started, Prox felt an excruciating pain under his right eye. Meanwhile, the technician stopped the test, saying that they were experiencing interference from the metal in his head. Prox was puzzled. He didn't have any metal in his head, or so he thought. The doctors looked at an older CT scan of Prox's head and were shocked to find something metal the size of a toothpick in the images. While leaving the doctor's office, Prox suddenly coughed up a 1-inch nail. The giant magnet in the MRI machine had dislodged a nail that was stuck in Prox's sinus cavity, sending it down his throat. Doctors thought he might have had the nail stuck in his head for 30 years. The doctors also told Prox when he sniffed up the nail, membrane tissue probably formed around it. The nail might have stayed there forever without the MRI. Although Prox did carpentry, he was bewildered as to how he got a nail up his nose without noticing it. Some very odd and disturbing things have been found in the human body, quite often by medical professionals. Before we go any further, let's discuss what this video is not about. Human beings sometimes have unusual, shall we say, inclinations, which can lead to needing medical assistance to remove items from the lower part of their intestinal system. As many medical professionals who work in an emergency room can tell you, some patients seem to have carefully thought out explanations where somehow they accidentally fell on various objects and those items got stuck. They're visiting the hospital for a rectal foreign body removal procedure because they're unable to remove the item on their own. Frankly, we could spend a whole video discussing this topic, but there are many forum discussions and X-ray pictures online that give veracity to such anecdotes. However, we have provided a short list called From the Internet of items which have been removed during medical exams or, in some cases, emergency surgery. Admittedly, most of these items aren't disturbing as of themselves. It's only when you think where they were found the disturbing factor comes into play. Barbie doll, Buzz Lightyear action figure, candle, candy cane, carrot, cell phone, champagne flute, cucumber, egg, eggplant, flashlight, fork, golf ball, impulse body spray perfume glass bottle, jar of instant coffee, jar of peanut butter, key, knife, light bulb, long-necked glass soda bottle, orange, pen, pepper shaker, ping pong ball, pint glass, plastic bowling pin, potato, salad tongs, salt shaker, screwdriver, shot glass, toothbrush, toy car, turnip, wine cork, zucchini. Now that we've settled that, who feels like sushi? In February of 2012, the Journal of Parasitology published a report on a 63-year-old Korean woman who experienced severe needle-like pain in her mouth while eating a dish of parboiled squid. She immediately spat the squid out, but it was too late. Upon examination by a doctor, 12 squid spermatophores were found to have implanted themselves into the mucous membrane of the woman's tongue, cheek, and gingiva. The parasites were promptly removed along with some of the woman's damaged oral tissues. Apparently, internal organs including the sperm bag weren't removed from the squid before meal preparation. A game played by some kids in India almost had deadly consequences for one of the players. In 2012, 12-year-old Anil Barela of Madhya Pradesh was messing around with some friends at a local river. The kids dared one another to swallow live fish. Anil took on the challenge. However, instead of going down Anil's esophagus, the 3.5-inch fish slipped down his windpipe and entered his left lung. Anil began to have trouble breathing and was rushed to the local hospital. The doctors measured the oxygen level in Anil's blood at 80%, 18 points lower than a normal 98%. An X-ray showed Anil's left lung as completely opaque due to the foreign object lodged in it. Doctors performed an emergency bronchoscopy and inserted a cable into Anil's lungs. The camera showed that the fish was still alive. Doctors then performed a 45-minute procedure to remove the fish. Anil made a full recovery. Planning on sticking to vegetables now? In another food-related mishap in the summer of 2010, 75-year-old retired schoolteacher Ron Svenden felt terrible. He was chronically fatigued, had lost his appetite, and frequently had coughing spells. A lifelong smoker, Ron had been battling emphysema for some time, but with the sudden turn in his health, he worried that he had cancer. When Ron was rushed to the hospital with a collapsed lung, his x-rays revealed something unusual. There was a 1.5-inch pea sprout growing in his lung. Much like Anil, doctors thought that while eating peas, one simply went down the wrong pipe and lodged in Ron's lung instead of ending up in his stomach. Ron was relieved to find out that he didn't have cancer and was also amazed. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten fresh peas either. Apparently, when a pea germinates, it simply needs a warm, wet place to begin to sprout. The pea shoot was removed from Ron's lung by a thoracic surgeon. As a joke, the hospital staff served Ron peas as part of his first meal after the operation. Ron took the joke in stride and ate them. Ron's not the only person to have a plant grow in their lungs. In 2009, Russian doctors operated on 28-year-old Artyom Sidyorkin, expecting to remove a tumor, and allegedly found a 2-inch fir seedling sprouting in his lung. Obviously, the results of ingesting non-food items can be very dangerous. 52-year-old Margaret Dahlman of the Netherlands showed up at the hospital complaining of a stomachache. Upon viewing x-rays of her stomach, doctors were dumbfounded to see a large mass of silverware. When going in for surgery, Margaret explained to the doctors that often when she sat down to eat, she couldn't help herself. She would ignore the meal and feast on the cutlery instead. Margaret had previously been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which left her with an urge to eat non-food items. The surgery removed 78 spoons and forks from Margaret's stomach. However, no knives were found.
Margaret was never interested in eating those, and she couldn't explain why. Margaret made a full recovery and underwent therapy for her predilection. Margaret's not the only one to suffer this strange affliction, though. Doctors have removed a variety of items that patients have ingested. Common non-food snacks are magnets, coin, and chalk. In 2014, a teenage girl from Kyrgyzstan's bad habit almost ended her life. Though her stomach was swollen, 18-year-old Aperi Alexieva kept losing weight and was dangerously dehydrated and malnourished. She couldn't keep any food down, even just drinking water brought about terrible pains. Doctors struggled to diagnose her at first and then figured out the culprit. A massive hairball was blocking her digestive system. Aperi had to be transported to a large hospital in the capital city of Bishkek for an emergency life-saving surgery to remove the 9-pound hairball. The hairball formed due to Aperi's proclivity to chew on and eat her hair and bits and pieces of wool she found on the carpet at home. Apparently, during her surgery, her stomach was so distended, hair began to ooze out as soon as the wall of Aperi's stomach was cut. Despite looking through 50 years of records, the doctor said they were unable to find any cases that involved a hairball this large. You heard correctly, not other cases involving a hairball, other cases involving a hairball this large. Sometimes after a vacation, you end up feeling more stressed than if you had just stayed at work. In the summer of 2007, Aaron Dallas of Carbondale, Colorado, visited the town of Orange Walk, Belize to assist with a mountain bike race. Upon returning home, he developed large, painful bumps on his head that bled and oozed. His doctor thought they were fly bites that would eventually heal up, but the bumps wouldn't heal. Aaron visited a specialist who thought he might have shingles, a painful rash caused by the varicella zoster virus, the same virus that causes chickenpox. Aaron tried several different creams and ointments, but to no avail. Weeks went by. Aaron started getting flashes of pain that would send him to his knees. It felt like spikes were being driven into his skull. Then the lumps started throbbing and moving. Aaron thought he was going crazy. He could even hear the lumps. Another visit to a doctor brought about the revelation that Aaron's scalp was infested with botfly larvae. Medical staff numbed Aaron's head and extracted 5 fingernail-sized maggots. Most likely, Aaron was bitten by a mosquito carrying botfly eggs. Mosquitoes, stable flies, and other insects are used by female botflies to disseminate their eggs to various hosts. In this case, the host was Aaron. Aaron's not the only person who's brought home an unexpected souvenir after a vacation. During the summer of 2013, the Franklin family of Aliso Viejo, California went on a camping trip to Spooner's Cove Beach on the central Californian coast. 4-year-old Paul fell and scraped his right knee on a rock. His parents cleaned up the small cut and put a band-aid on it. However, the wound kept seeping and never seemed to scab over. A week later, Paul fell on the knee again while ice skating, further opening the wound. His mother once again cleaned and redressed the cut. Over the next few weeks, Paul's knee became swollen and infected. He began to limp. Thinking he had a staph infection, his parents took him to the doctor. At first, a 10-day course of antibiotics seemed to improve the infection, but then it flared up again. The cut began seeping pus and a small black lump grew under Paul's skin. His mother worried that the wound was becoming necrotic. Against doctor's advice, she squeezed the lump, and an odd-looking tiny rock popped out of Paul's knee. His mother took a closer look at the pebble, noticing a swirl pattern. She realized it was a tiny snail, and it was alive. The Franklins figured that there were snail eggs on the rock Paul scraped his knee on. Paul's parents let him keep the snail as a pet, and he named it Turbo, after the cartoon snail. We could go on and on about the various insects, larvae, tapeworms, and spiders that have been discovered and removed from people. Ears and nose seem to be especially popular hiding places, perhaps because of the easy access. However, we'll spare you and leave it to your imagination. In 2015, Estela Melendez, a 91-year-old resident of La Boca, Chile, went to the hospital after a fall. She had an X-ray and was told by doctors she had a tumor in her abdomen and needed surgery. A second X-ray was ordered for confirmation and it revealed something shocking. The mass was not a tumor, but a fetus. For the last 60 years, Estela had a lump in her abdomen but didn't know that she was carrying a lithopedion, or stone baby. It's a rare phenomenon that occurs when a fetus dies during pregnancy and is too large to be reabsorbed by the mother. As part of a foreign body reaction, the fetus calcifies on the outside, protecting the mother's body from dead tissue and preventing infection. There have been about 300 cases of known lithopedion worldwide.
with the calcified fetus being carried for an average of 22 years. In several cases, the mother was able to become pregnant again and gave birth to children without incident. In the case of Estella, the mass was only sometimes uncomfortable, but not causing serious pain. Medical professionals decided not to proceed with surgery. However, sometimes doctors do remove a lithopedion. In 2009, 92-year-old Huang Yijun from China had a 60-year-old fetus removed. In 1948, when she was 31, she became pregnant only to find that she had a rare condition. Instead of implanting in the uterus as normal, her pregnancy was ectopic, with the egg implanting outside her fallopian tubes, causing what's known as an abdominal pregnancy. The fetus soon passed away, and doctors told Huang Yijun to get it removed to avoid any potential future health problems. Unfortunately, the surgery was expensive, and Huang simply didn't have the money. So she ignored her condition until she was able to have it removed some 60 years later. Our last story of something disturbing removed from a person's body is about an interesting and creepy medical phenomenon which is estimated to occur in 1 in 500,000 live births. All his life, Sanju Bhagat of Nagpur, India, had breathing problems and a protruding belly. Over time, his stomach swelled even further, making him look like he was 9 months pregnant. One night in June of 1999, his breathing problems got worse, and an ambulance rushed the 36-year-old farmer to the hospital. Doctors began to operate, thinking that Sanju had a large tumor pressing on his diaphragm. As they cut into Sanju's stomach, unexpectedly gallons of liquid gushed out. Then the doctors found something unsettling. Sanju had a twin. In his stomach, there was a half-formed fetus with hair, bones, and developed hands with long fingernails. Sanju had one of the world's rarest and most bizarre medical conditions, fetus in fetu. It's an extremely rare development abnormality that occurs early in pregnancy when a fetus gets trapped inside its twin. The parasitic twin leeches off the dominant twin as the fetuses continue to grow. Usually, both fetuses die before birth from the strain of sharing a placenta. However, in some cases such as Sanju's, the host twin survives and is born. It is possible for the trapped fetus to survive past birth by forming an umbilical cord-like structure that leaches its twin's blood supply. Fewer than 90 cases of fetus in fetu have been recorded in medical literature, though. Sanju's case is even more unusual because no one suspected Bhagat had a twin inside him for 36 years. After surgery, Sanju's ability to breathe improved and he made a full recovery. As a kid, Sanju had been bullied and teased that he was pregnant. Ironically, his tormentors were sort of right. The date is March 1943, and in a prisoner of war camp inside occupied Poland, Royal Canadian Air Force pilot William Ashe approaches the camp's toilet facilities. A single POW leans against the latrine's doorways, casually keeping watch on the rest of the camp. The POW nods at Ashe as he approaches and allows him to enter the small, squat latrine. Inside are 2 rows of toilets built in the classic Roman style. 9 boxed-in seats ring the sides of the room and consist of nothing more than concrete boxes with no dividers between them. The wooden seats led down to a large concrete pit underneath, where hundreds of prisoners relieve themselves into every day. A small hole leads to a huge sewage pit, which is drained every week into the waiting truck of a local farmer who uses the camp's waste to fertilize his fields. As Ashe enters the building, he spots 2 men seated at the far seats, who return his nod of greeting. One of them stands and lifts the seat he was just sitting on, revealing a hole in the concrete that's just barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. The stench of human waste wafts up from below, powerful enough to make the men's eyes tear up as they fight the urge to vomit. Yet, powering through the horrid assault on their nostrils, the men climb down into the hole one by one. As they land, a few inches of wastewater splash urine and feces all over the men. But they ignore it as they turn their attention to the task at hand. The men remove a panel that's been made to look like a false wall and reveal a small chamber beyond, which has been carved from the frozen soil itself. Using candles made of boot strings and margarine held in a tin dish, the men joined 3 others who were already waiting there and stripped down to their underwear. One man sits at a bellows made of old leather kit bags, and as he works it, he pushes air through a pipe made of old cans into the tunnel which the crew has been digging for weeks now. 2 men now move down into that tunnel while the remainder stay behind to handle the soil that the diggers displace in their dig. The entire crew is split up into shifts, with some men taking turns digging while others man the bellows, dispose of the dirt, or stands watch above. Disposal of the dirt is accomplished by pushing the dirt through the sump directly onto the toilets above and into the huge sewage pit beyond.
Once a week, Polish farmer Franciszek Lewandowski arrives at the camp and pumps the sewage out for use on his farm. Yet Lewandowski has begun to notice more and more dirt in the wastewater. Before he has a chance to complain to the Nazi guards, though, another prisoner, Józef Birks, a young Czechoslovakian, informs Lewandowski of the escape plan. The Polish farmer is no fan of the Nazis, especially after their invasion and occupation of his home, and keeps the plan a secret, doing his part to aid the would-be escapees by dutifully carting away the soil. As the digging team finishes its work for the day, the third team enters the tunnel and begins the job of shoring up the tunnel walls and ceiling. The tunneling work, carried out with nothing more than cut-out aluminum cans, is dangerous work, and the tunnel is under constant threat of collapse. Each day that the tunnel extends further and deeper, the men require just a little bit more courage to enter the dark tunnel, not knowing if that's the day the tunnel will collapse and trap them with little or no hope of rescue. It's the job of the third team then to enter and shore up the sides and ceiling as best they can, using wooden boards taken from their barracks and even the bed frames themselves. The boards make for a rudimentary shoring but help add a little bit of safety to the entire endeavor as they shore up the freshly dug length of tunnel. The men also extend the air pipe, which brings in oxygen to the tunneling crew. They use powdered milk cans for the job, cutting them so that they fit end to end. The air they pump is from the latrine itself and fetid with the stench of human waste, but it brings life-saving oxygen as the men dig deeper and further into the earth. To expedite the process of digging, the men have developed an ingenious system to move freshly dug earth to the latrine sump for disposal. 2 lengths of rope extend down the tunnel, and at one end is an empty sack. The diggers fill the sack with dirt and then give the rope a sharp tug, which causes the man at the halfway point to begin hauling on the rope to bring the dirt out of the tunnel. Once it reaches the midway point, that man attaches it to the second rope, whose end he has with him, and then gives that rope a sharp tug. The men at the entrance then drag the sack from the halfway point all the way to the entrance of the tunnel, where the dirt is emptied into the latrine sump. The system is rudimentary and nowhere as near sophisticated as the homemade railroad tracks and trolleys that the men at the Stalag Luft 3 prison complex would use to escape and serve as inspiration for the film The Great Escape. Yet the process saves countless hours of labor, as it takes half an hour to squeeze down the 2-foot by 2-foot tunnel each day. In early March of 1943, the team digging at the end of the tunnel began to dig directly upwards. By their calculations, they've dug several hundred feet past the perimeter fencing, a task which required them to not just dig out from their starting point, but down into the rocky soil to a depth of over a dozen feet, in order to avoid the seismic sensors that the Germans have installed to detect digging. Once well out of the fence, the tunnel begins to angle upwards again, and now the men are digging straight up. One of them takes a long stick and pushes it into the ceiling above, feeling resistance for 2 feet before the stick gives way to the top side. The tunnel is finished, and to avoid detection, the last 2 feet of the tunnel will be dug up on the day of their escape. Now the men prepare for their breakout. While the dig teams were working for weeks on the tunnel, Birsk, the young Czech, has been helping secure fake papers for the escapees. To do this, he managed to talk his way into being part of a detail that's taken every week under guard to a produce store in town. There, the prisoner detail buys a few luxuries for the POWs, such as chocolate, cigarettes, and the sorts. They pay for this from the meager wages paid to them by the German government under its obligations to pay POWs for their labor via the Geneva Convention. At the store, a young Polish girl, Stefania Maludzenska, works behind the counter, and it isn't long before she's swooning at Birk's charms. She's been helping to smuggle letters to Birk's family members for months, but now the escapees need her help in far more dangerous work. Stefania has friends who work at town hall, and she has them steal official German forms that will serve as a template for the forged identity papers needed by the escapees. Their identity papers will ID the escapees as Polish citizens after their escape, allowing them to bypass security checkpoints and hide their identities as POWs. Yet, for the papers to look legitimate, there's one more thing that's needed: a photograph of each of the escapees to adorn their fake papers. To get these photographs, Stefania takes the biggest risk of her life and helps secure a small camera and film from a Polish laborer who used to be a teacher before the German invasion. Now he's forced to do hard labor and work rebuilding the same roads the Germans themselves bombed in the invasion. And helping the prisoners escape will be his small measure of revenge against the Nazis. The camera and the film is smuggled into camp via a 17-year-old boy who routinely brings a shipment of the prisoners' daily allowance of bread, all hidden safely amongst the loaves. After the prisoners take their photos, the film is then smuggled out through the same young teenage boy who develops the photos himself in a makeshift photo lab inside his parents' tiny apartment. All of
of these brave Polish civilians assisting the escapees are taking huge risks, and discovery of their involvement would certainly lead to a quick execution. The date for the breakout is set to be March 5th, as those amongst the prisoners with meteorological knowledge estimate that this will be the next moonless night. In order to have the best chance of escape, the men must move under the cover of deepest darkness, and with no moon in the sky, they stand a good chance of being unseen by the perimeter sentries. The men decide that immediately after 5 p.m. roll call, a group of them will head straight to the tunnel and wall themselves in until after lockup at 9 p.m., when the rest of the group will sneak out of their bunks and make their way to the tunnel. A mathematician amongst them calculates that the tunnel will be able to support up to 33 men for 6 hours before the oxygen runs out and the men asphyxiate. The figures and the math are both rough, but it's the best the men have to go on. At 5 p.m. on March 5th, the guards line up the POWs and conduct their daily count. Satisfied that all men are accounted for, they're left alone for recreation time. 800 men move to the recreation ground where a rugby match has been staged in order to help cover the escape attempt. The men plotting their escape conceal clean clothes under their coats, their pockets stuffed with a concoction termed the mixture, a high-energy food made by the prisoners. In each of their pockets are also their identification papers, a map of the region, and a homemade compass. Overhead, gray clouds build up and cold gusts of wind force the German guards to seek what shelter they can inside their guard towers. The men head to the latrine in pairs, and once inside, ditch their overcoats and make their way into the filth below. As the night goes on, the men are relieved to discover that the calculations for oxygen supply were correct. And at last, 9 p.m. rolls around, along with the final group to enter the escape tunnel. The men break through the last 2 feet of dirt at the end of the tunnel and crawl out into freedom. Grateful to leave the smelly, stinking tunnel behind at last, the men break up into groups and head in different directions so as not to draw attention to themselves, posing as travelers. Unfortunately, within the end of the week, all 36 escapees would be recaptured by the Germans, with many sent off to new prison camps. Though the escape ultimately failed, it proved to be one of the most daring and smelliest escapes of World War II, inspiring many heroic attempts by other Allied soldiers throughout the rest of the conflict. If you caught our show on the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, you'll know all about what happened on April 25, 1986, and how it shook the world. What you might not know is that it could have been much, much worse had it not been for the extremely brave people we're going to talk about today. But first, let's see what happened on that fateful day. Prior to that disaster, there were around 14,000 people living in this Ukrainian city of Chernobyl, which is located around 90 kilometers northeast of the capital, Kiev. You can actually visit there today, but it's somewhat a ghost town, and the few residents that live there stay outside of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. What happened back in the 80s was basically an explosion of one of the reactors at the nuclear plant. It's said around 50 people died as a direct result of the explosion, but the World Health Organization tells us that around 4,000 people died as an indirect result of the Big Bang. We are further told that thousands of people were exposed to high levels of radiation, but millions more were exposed to lower levels of radiation. The full extent of the damage is difficult to say, but the WHO says some people who were exposed to this radiation have a higher risk of getting cancer in their lifetime. How did it happen? We'll answer that first, and then get around to the question of what could have happened if it weren't for our exceptionally valiant trio of heroes, sometimes called the Suicide Squad. We could basically say human error, but as with many disasters, there have been what you might call a perfect storm of things that went wrong. We'll summarize here, as we've done a show on this already. The World Nuclear Association explains that workers at Chernobyl Reactor 4 were doing tests, and to cut a long story short, the power of the reactor plummeted, and so workers tried to increase the power. Then there was a power surge, and all hell was about to break loose. There was a lot of steam, and a huge amount of pressure was building up inside one of the reactors. This eventually blew off a 1,000-ton lid on the reactor, causing radiation to leak while air got into the reactor, which caused a fire, a very big fire. A second explosion ensued when hydrogen was formed by hot water steam contacting zirconium. This was even bigger than the first explosion. Now there was debris flying around, fires breaking out, dust so thick it was hard to see, an electricity blackout, and no working phone lines. It was mayhem.
Firefighters did arrive though, but they weren't aware of all that dangerous radiation in the air. Even after they did manage to contain the blaze, the workers as well as the residents of the town did not know what kind of danger they were in. It took hours to totally put that raging fire out, but nothing could stop the spread of radiation that was now traveling far and wide. As we said, some people still live in parts of town today, but not in the areas that were hit most by the radiation. You can even take a tour of the town that was, and it is supposed to be a spooky experience as people just up and left, leaving many of their things behind them. It's now said that wild animals have come from the nearby forests and they're the new inhabitants of the town. Okay, so what could have happened? In the book Chernobyl 12340, the incredible true story of the world's worst nuclear disaster, we're told that under the reactor was a massive pool of water, which was there to act as a coolant. What the workers knew, or some of them, was that they couldn't allow all the hot radioactive metal to reach that pool of water. The author of this book said in an interview, if that happened, it would have triggered a second steam explosion that would have done unimaginable damage and destroyed the entire power station, including the 3 other reactors. He goes as far as to say that such a blast could have denuded Europe of about half of its citizens and would have left part of the continent uninhabitable for many thousands of years due to radiation. He is not alone either in saying that. A former Soviet physicist called Vasily Nestorenko said this: "Our experts studied the possibility and concluded that the explosion would have had a force of 3 to 5 megatons. Minsk, which is 320 kilometers from Chernobyl, would have been razed and Europe rendered uninhabitable." This is where the Suicide Squad comes in. These guys knew that they had to drain the pool, but there was a problem in that the basement was flooded and they couldn't get to the valves to drain it. One story goes that the 3 men on the scene, 2 plant staff and 1 soldier, decided to man up and don wetsuits and swim through the water to get to these valves. It said they had a light, but when their lamp failed to work, they were in total darkness. They were told that this mission was likely a suicide mission, because if they didn't drown, they were probably going to die from such a huge amount of radiation exposure. Yep, it sounds like a Hollywood movie, and we can imagine a tear-jerking crescendo as these brave guys swim in darkness, and there are ample cuts to their distraught wives and wailing children. But this ain't Hollywood, this is real life. While there may have been cheers as those men managed to open the valves and drain the pool, if there was an extended version of the film, it would include 3 men then dying slowly in a hospital from acute radiation syndrome. This is often abbreviated as ARS. Now the movie cuts to 3 guys vomiting all the time, having seizures, terrible headaches, feeling dizzy, perhaps experiencing necrosis of the skin, and ultimately dying a really horrible death. This, we might say, is not so much Hollywood but grim European realism. It might actually work in Russian cinema, but such a movie would be way too depressing to attract Hollywood financiers. This was the story that circulated for a long time, but the author of the book we just mentioned said he spent 5 years researching the disaster and found out that things were a little different. The basement entry, while dangerous, wasn't quite as dramatic as modern myth would have you believe, he said in an interview. He said that firefighters had tried to drain the pool before these 3 guys, all plant workers, and no soldiers came to the scene. He said many people tried to empty that pool and we don't know what happened to them. He also said that it's true that the basement was flooded and it was hard to find the valves, but he said the water was only waist high. Still, radiation was everywhere, and the men, Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov, were at risk as they waited around in search of those valves. It was like finding a needle in a haystack, said the writer, adding that this place was a massive network of valves and pipes, and finding the right one seemed impossible to those men. But they found the right valves in the end. When the searchlight beam fell on the pipe, they were joyous, one of the men later said in an interview with the Soviet media. The pipe led to the valves, he added, and it was a job well done. They then turned the valves and they'd heard the rush of water being emptied from the tank. It said that there was about 5 million gallons of water, which is well over 18 million liters. Then, it did get a bit Hollywood, we're told, as when the men got back to the rest of the people waiting for them to finish their mission, there was a lot of hooting and hugs. But what about the slow, painful death from ARS? Well, we're told that that didn't happen the way it has sometimes been described. It's said one of those guys died some years later from a heart attack, but the other survived. The author of the book said he knew one of them was still working in the same industry, and the other he knew was certainly alive up until 2015 at least. He kind of lost the man after that year. People did die of ARS after the disaster, but not those 3 men, according to him. He said it is quite hard to get to the heart of the matter, as after the event, the Soviet Union tried to downplay the incident, and all the most accurate information has still not been translated from Russian. He did say, though, that these 3 guys likely prevented a bigger disaster happening that could have killed millions of people. In an interview, he said they still went into a pitch-black, badly damaged basement beneath a molten reactor core that was slowly burning its way down to them. We might also say that many people risked their lives during this disaster and during the long cleanup afterwards. These folks are sometimes called the liquidators, and they number in the thousands. According to something called the Chernobyl Union, 25,000 of the Russian liquidators are dead and 70,000 disabled, about the same in Ukraine, and 10,000 dead in Belarus, and 25,000 disabled. We might add, though, that the number of people said to have gotten sick or died because of exposure to large amounts of radiation is a very controversial topic, and many reports differ. Studies have also shown that the millions of people exposed to smaller amounts of radiation should not be at a higher risk of cancer, except perhaps thyroid cancer. We can say with assurance, though, that a lot of brave people put their lives at risk. In an interview, one of the liquidators said he knew the risks, but he just had to do his job. "I'm worried for the future," he said. "I get my blood checked twice a month. I go through the scanners 4 times a day, but the pay is good and someone has to do this." We're told that the areas most exposed to large amounts of radiation won't be safe to live for 20,000 years. There are many horrific devices of the distant past that were intended to inflict unbearable pain or flat out kill their target. Some of these, such as the brazen bull, a brass statue in which the victim would be burned alive, sound pretty terrifying. The breast ripper or pear of anguish are other examples of things that you just know you wouldn't want to have happen. But say you were captive and those in charge threatened to bring out the wheel, the Catherine wheel. You might think, well, that doesn't actually sound so bad. You'd be in for quite a shock. We'll explain why in this episode of the Infographics Show, the Catherine Wheel, Worst Punishments. According to legends, the Catherine Wheel is named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who is a patron to those academically or philosophically inclined and prevents unexpected death. Now, there's no mention of this individual before the 9th century, although she supposedly lived in the 4th, so it's suspected that she did not truly exist. Nevertheless, her story was a well-known one that began in Egypt. She was believed to be noble, if not a princess, as well as very studious. However, some might consider it less than wise that she rose up to protest the wrongs of the then Roman emperor of the time, Maxentius, who was relentlessly persecuting Christians. Maxentius allegedly selected several scholars to engage in a battle of wits with the young Catherine, but ultimately the wise men lost. As a further insult, while she was imprisoned for her words, Catherine managed to convert many of Maxentius's soldiers and even his wife to the Christian religion. Needless to say, that didn't exactly sit well with Maxentius. After torture in which she declared Jesus Christ her spouse, she was sentenced to death. This is when the wheel came into play, which was the intended executionary device. The story goes that it shattered at her touch, and so in desperation the emperor ultimately had her beheaded. She was then carried to Mount Sinai. Interestingly, later on, St. Joan of Arc identified Catherine's voice as one of the several she heard. So what is this wheel that Catherine had miraculously escaped, but that went on to kill many of the less fortunate? Another name it's known by, the breaking wheel, will probably give you some ideas. It was a wheel made of wood, similar if not the same as those used on carriages. In addition to being made of hefty wood, these wheels were outfitted with a metal rim, though sometimes they would be modified so that they could inflict further damage with protruding iron blades. These massive wheels would then be dropped on convicts all over their body, breaking bones upon impact. Another approach was to tie a person to the wheel and hit his or her limbs with iron hammers or bars while the wheel was rotated. As long as the bones were shattered, that was all that mattered. The exact amount of wheel drops or hammer hits were already determined beforehand. This would depend on the extent of the convict's crimes, such as if they committed acts of robbery or murder. For the worst offenders, efforts were made to better match their punishment to the crimes. For example, sharp pieces of wood would sometimes be set underneath the victim to bring yet further torture. On the other hand, for those they wanted to spare the worst, they could deliver a fatal blow during the wheel dropping or iron hitting process or right after it was over. Unfortunately, most were not so lucky, and the bone breaking was only the beginning, or step 1 of 2 or 3. Following step 1, bodies were typically threaded through the spokes of another wheel. While this would be difficult to do with a normal person, it was much easier once their limbs were broken. The wheel was then attached to a pole and displayed for all to see, much like those who had undergone crucifixion. At this point, some would be cut apart or strangled, which would finally, though painfully, end their suffering. Others would be placed above a blazing fire, or alternatively thrown directly in one. It was even possible for the individual to be hung while on the wheel, though this option was generally reserved for those who had been found guilty of either the very worst crimes or multiple serious offenses. The executioners in charge had no mercy, even upon the souls of those they had killed. Bodies were simply left where they had been thrown or hung up to be eaten away by the beaks, teeth, and claws of wild animals. Many believed that this would prevent the souls from ever finding eternal peace. It would also serve as a gruesome warning to others. But there was one little hope for those sentenced to death by the Catherine wheel, and that was if they somehow became disengaged or if the wheel in some way failed to do its job. In these circumstances, it was seen as divine intervention, and the conflict's life would ultimately be spared. However, this was highly unlikely. It happened so rarely that when it did, it would become the subject of religious paintings depicting the miracle. More often than not, those given this sentence never made it into the works of art. Further, their suffering could drag on seemingly endlessly before they died. There are stories of a murderer in the 14th century who held on for 3 days before he expired. Another time, a man by the name of Bonadies lasted for 4 full days and nights. A more questionable account of a German serial killer in the 1500s claimed that he remained alive with the help of alcohol for as many as 9 days. But again, more likely than not, this last account is just another legend. The Catherine or breaking wheel was quite a horrible device. It was used as a method of public execution in Europe from antiquity to early modern times. Bavaria utilized it until it was outlawed in 1813, and its suspected last use was in Prussia as late as 1841. We are all too thankful, as are modern-day criminals, that over time it lost favor with most societies. September 20th, 2019, the day that the people of Earth discovered that the US government has been hiding the presence of extraterrestrials from the public. Our millennia of intergalactic solitude has finally come to an end, and the greatest question ever asked by science has at last been answered. Are we alone? For decades, the people of Earth have been visited by aliens from another planet, who have worked in secret cooperation with the United States government. These aliens have crossed the vast distances of intergalactic space with mind-bending technologies in order to mutilate cows, show up as blurry blobs in videos, and conduct experiments on abductees, involving probes in very uncomfortable places. The truth is no longer out there, it's finally here, or in the open. Or perhaps September 20th, 2019 will merely be the day that many hundreds of misled people get arrested for trespassing by the US government, earning hefty fines, long sentences in a federal prison, and ending up with experiments involving probes in very uncomfortable places of a totally different sort. Today we're going to look at the phenomenon that has swept the internet. The massive plan to raid Area 51 and plunder it of its alien secrets, and turn to a friend of the show and former security expert for the US military as he tells us why storming Area 51 is a terrible idea. On June 27th, a Facebook event hosted by 3 different Facebook accounts appeared publicly, entitled simply Storm Area 51. They can't stop all of us. The event would later be claimed by a Maddie Roberts as having been started in jest, but the joke very quickly caught on and went global. As of this writing, 1.7 million people have signed on to the event, and another 1.3 million are interested. The official date is set for September 20th, 2019, for the hours between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. While Roberts has come forward and explained that it was a joke, he did so only after the event skyrocketed in popularity and out of fear that should something really happen, that the US government would be looking for him for being the ringleader. He wanted to publicly declare that the event was a joke, and he was in no way serious about storming Area 51. Whether he was serious or not is likely not to matter come September 20th. With the event gaining popularity around the world, While most people signed on to the event as a satirical joke, it's clear from the Facebook page for the event that there are plenty of people who see the opportunity to rush the secretive restricted area en masse as a way to at last plunder its secrets. The rallying cry of "they can't stop us all" has made many people take the event seriously, and it's now feared that on September 20th a large group of people will make a serious attempt to enter the secretive base. Recently, the US Air Force sent out a message addressing the online joke, warning that any attempts to illegally access the area is highly discouraged. So, could enough people breach the secret base's defenses? What would happen if they did? And why all the hoopla over Area 51 anyways? Area 51 is situated in a remote corner of the Nevada Test and Training Range at Groom Lake, which is a large expanse of desert where US pilots hone their abilities dropping live and dummy ordnance on ground targets. It was so remote, in fact, that it quickly became the premier destination for developing new and advanced planes for the CIA and the US Air Force. It was, for instance, where the infamous U-2 spy plane was originally developed, a technological marvel of its time which flew so high that it was for years out of reach of Soviet fighters and missiles. The facility was also the home of the infamous Skunk Works, a group of engineers who developed some of the world's most advanced airplanes, and from which the likes of the SR-71 and the F-117 came from. Any other information to include if the legendary Skunk Works still operates from the site is difficult to verify, as the entire facility remains a highly classified secret, and the US government barely even acknowledges its presence. Satellite imagery of the site, though, shows that indeed several buildings and flight lines have been constructed, and curiously enough, a flight line long enough to land even the biggest aircraft developed anywhere in the world is clearly visible. Others claim that you can see in some satellite images how the flight lines lead to underground bunkers, though the veracity of those claims is dubious at best. If alien life was visiting planet Earth and the United States government had in fact gotten its hands on some of that alien tech, or was cooperating with aliens, it seems that Area 51 would be the ideal place for such activity. The site is notoriously remote and difficult to get to, miles away from any road and difficult to spy on due to the mountains that border it. But could you penetrate it, and if you did, what would happen? Our expert warns us immediately that any attempt to penetrate a restricted military facility comes with serious consequences. This isn't Stranger Things, this is real life, and trying to get into a restricted area can land you with serious jail time, huge fines, or worse. Trespassing on a restricted military facility can carry a penalty of up to 10 years in federal prison and is often accompanied by a fine of tens of thousands of dollars, which you will be obligated to pay before or after your prison sentence. Naturally, though, the condition of your trespass is often taken into consideration, with our expert telling us that if it's clear you were inadvertently trespassing, then you would likely simply be apprehended, searched, debriefed, and then driven back to a point outside of the facility and be freed to go. If, however, your trespass was purposeful, you might get the book thrown at you, specifically if it seemed like your trespass was malicious in nature, as in you were actively trying to steal government materials or secrets. Different restricted areas have different levels of secrecy, however, and some places, termed Black World facilities, are so secretive that your trespass and ensuing trial are all kept under the strictest of measures of secrecy, with no details of your trial becoming public knowledge. No, you're not tried by some secretive shadow court and condemned to the dark side of the moon, but rather your trial and everyone involved, including your lawyer and any witnesses, are all forced to sign extremely harsh confidentiality agreements with very, very strict penalties for breaking them. That is, of course, if you are arrested, because our expert tells us that there is one more option for dealing with trespassers, and that's to simply shoot them. No, this isn't Soviet Russia, where you can get shot for just hopping a fence to a military base, but our expert warns us that there are concentric rings of security around restricted facilities, and if you penetrate deep enough through those rings of security, you eventually hit one ring where deadly force is authorized, no questions asked. Of course, these areas are always very clearly marked by signs which state as much, so there's no chance you would wander into an area where you could just get shot for being there with no authorization. You would have to make the choice to continue pushing forward, despite the risks. The reason why these harsh measures exist is simple. Some secrets are so vital to national security that the government cannot risk their being discovered by foreign governments. Take, for instance, the Manhattan Project. If knowledge of how to build a working nuclear weapon was discovered by the Germans, the entire course of the war may have taken a radically different route. If you manage to penetrate the outer layers of security and get to those shoot first, ask questions later areas, then it means that you're there on a mission and you're likely seeking to cause great harm to the US. So what would happen if you joined 1.7 million people in rushing Area 51? Would you get to see dem aliens? First, our expert tells us that you would run into a sign warning you that you're entering into a restricted area, and typically warning you of the penalties for doing so. Most secretive government facilities aren't behind huge fences, as that would be far too obvious a giveaway, but rather they rely on extreme remoteness and large tracts of empty land to discourage anyone getting too close. Throughout this seemingly empty landscape are security patrols dispersed throughout the first two outer rings of security, and even if you don't see them, odds are that they see you. Armed with high-powered visual aids, night vision, and thermal imagers, these security personnel are vectored in on trespassers by sensors hidden under the ground, pressure sensors buried under avenues of approach, and seismic sensors throughout the entire outer perimeter give alarm operators perfect situational awareness of the miles of empty landscape surrounding the secret facility. And typically a host of hidden high-power cameras allow them to spy on any portion of their perimeter. If trespassers are detected, they're typically allowed to wander through the first outer perimeter of security without being intercepted. That's because these areas are so large and remote that people wander in and out by accident all the time. And the security personnel at the facility prefer that you never even find out you had inadvertently strolled into somewhere you weren't supposed to. The entire time you're in the first ring of security, though, you will be closely monitored from afar, sometimes even by air through drones, and likely not have a clue that you're being spied on. If, however, you continue forward, you will reach the second outer ring of security, much smaller than the first outer ring. The second ring is continuously patrolled by security personnel on foot or in vehicles, and penetrating it will result in a security patrol being immediately dispatched to apprehend you. Our expert tells us that you likely won't get too far through this second ring of security, as you'll have been carefully observed the entire time you approached it through the first ring. A patrol will move to your position and apprehend you, search you and your vehicles, and typically debrief you or just move you straight back to the outermost perimeter and warn you not to return. Should you somehow evade detection or capture, though, you'll reach the inner ring of security, or at least the inner ring of the outer security zone, because there remains one more inner ring that's within the facility buildings itself. Here, movement of personnel is highly restricted, even amongst the personnel who work at the facility. And even though you may have the clearance to work at one part of the facility, you may not have been cleared for any other part of the same facility. In this inner ring, though, even the base staff have to be on high alert against straying where they don't belong. For you, a complete outsider who doesn't belong at all, straying into this area could be deadly. It's here that signs warning the use of deadly force are placed, and while it can be up to the discretion of the security commander or even the individual patrol that discovers you, you really don't want to press your luck. Remember, only really bad guys would be interested in getting this close to a secret facility, so any responding security personnel are going to assume that you're out to cause some serious harm to the US. We cannot stress enough how dangerous it would be to penetrate this area. These are all, of course, the outer layers of security, and inside each facility our expert tells us that even more stringent security measures exist, with even greater repercussions for violating them. He would not elaborate on inner security measures, but did tell us that many times the guards restricting access to the facility might themselves not have a high enough clearance to be inside the facility itself. That's how seriously classified some facilities are, and an entirely different team of guards with an even higher security clearance may be assigned to work the actual insides of the facility. Though our expert would not comment much on the inner workings of restricted facilities, he did leave us with this story. I was assigned to a facility with two outer doors, each with a more stringent set of security measures to verify your identity before you could pass. The outer door was open to the outside world, and the second door, where I was located, was inside a small room connected to that first outer door. There was a scanner machine that worked automatically, and my job was twofold: ensure nobody trying to access the facility messed with the machine as it verified their identity and credentials, and if the machine ever set off an alarm, I was to immediately terminate the individual attempting entry. Once the machine granted entry, I was not allowed to look inside the open door and had to stand with my back to whatever the door opened up into. After speaking with our expert, it's clear that storming Area 51 would be a terrible idea. While group posts claim that they can't stop all of us, our expert warns that yes, they very much have the means and firepower to stop even a major incursion event, and that if whatever is inside Area 51 is of vital national security importance, then they will do just that. He He warns us that the most sensitive of these facilities were designed to stop a full-scale military assault. Also, though he would not go into specifics, our expert told us that in all likelihood, even if you managed to defeat the outer security, you would simply be never able to access the actual facilities themselves, as part of their security measures include the ability to completely lock out the outside world. We talked about what happens when you die, a show that proved to be very popular. We think it's only right we now talk about how you came into this world. We don't know exactly how they came up with this number, but some scientists say that the odds of you being born were 1 in 400 quadrillion. Yeah, you are special, and don't you ever forget that. First, there were the odds of your father hooking up with your mother, and one scientist told Business Insider that those odds were 1 in 20,000. Then you have the odds of them staying together, getting past the first date, then the second, and staying with each other until they decided to have you. We're told to get to this point the odds are around 1 in 40 million. Now come the big odds, because your mom will be born with 1 to 2 million eggs, 500 of which will be ovulated, and your dad will make around 500 billion sperm. Basically, the fact that one sperm met one egg and made you is pretty amazing. We also have to remember that for your parents to exist, their ancestors had to too. Going back to the beginning of the human race, you being born was nothing short of a miracle. So we know that for you to exist, many things had to happen, but let's just talk about the day or night that you started off. We're sure you had enough education to know that for you to exist, your mother and father had to make love. Not many people like thinking about this, but that's just what happened. You probably also know that each time people make love without any type of contraception, it doesn't mean guaranteed pregnancy. There are many factors, including the age of the people as well as when they made love and the people's reproductive systems. Some people have to try very hard to make a kid, while other couples can't seem to miss. One doctor from the Women's College Hospital in St. Joseph's Health Centre in Toronto said that if the woman is under 35, she has an 85% of conceiving in 1 year when making love in each menstrual cycle. The average cycle lasts 28 days. The woman will ovulate after her period. The ovulation part starts about 14 days on average after the first day of her last period. In many cases, this part will happen about 2 weeks before the woman has her next period. The woman will make an egg which is released by the ovaries and it's passed down the fallopian tubes where it can meet a sperm. This lucky sperm can then fertilize the egg and voila! The process of making a baby is on the way. To make a baby, you don't need to wait for the ovulation period, and you might not know that a man's sperm can wait outside a woman for this egg to be made. It's said sperm can live in a woman about 5 days, although most don't survive that long. Okay, so we know that a woman needs to produce an egg and a sperm that has to reach that egg and fertilize it. But did you know that a man will create around 525 billion sperm cells in a lifetime? Something which led the now deceased comedian Bill Hicks to say he has wasted entire civilizations from releasing sperm when not making love. Live science tells us that just one single shot can carry up to 40 million to 1.2 billion sperm cells. Why on earth do we need so many of these things? Scientists tell us that the reason is basically because of competition. The more sperm, the better chance one will get to the egg. The highest sperm producers have the better chance of passing on their genes. The distance the sperm has to travel to meet the magic egg is only 15 centimeters, but this is no easy swim. Some of them just flow back after takeoff, while others are killed by acidic fluids inside the woman. These are basically non-starters. But of the many millions that are launched, about 2 million make it to base 1, the cervix. Here some just run into walls and die, while others get trapped in mucus. It's quite the race for those sperm and always fraught with danger. However, about 1 million will make it to base 2, the uterus. Unfortunately, many come undone here and get taken out by white blood cells. About 10,000 are now left and have made it all the way to the top of the uterus. They then head to the oviduct, and women have 2 of those but rarely make eggs in each. That means that about half of those dear sperm choose the wrong door, and there's nothing behind it. The ones that went the right way will have to face the uterotubal junction, a place where the oviduct and the uterus is connected. This busy junction is tricky for the sperm to get through, and many get stuck in mucus. From millions, we now have about 1,000 survivors heading to where the star prize is kept, down the fallopian tubes. Many don't make it all the way to the egg and just die. A sad thing when you think about how far they've made it. But it gets worse, because there can only be one, in the words of Highlander. something happens called a cortical reaction, which is basically the woman's egg blocking out multiple sperms. Sometimes there is a winner, and that tough sperm that won one of the hardest races in the world is a part of you. It's by no means a done deal though, as there's a chance of miscarriage. This often happens early, and if a woman gets past the 14-week mark, she only has a 1% chance of losing the baby. So now, we're in business. You're on your way to being born. There are stages of pregnancy, and we call these stages trimesters. The entire pregnancy should last on average about 40 weeks, but as you know, some babies come out early. From the first week until the 12th week we call the first trimester. During this time, the woman will likely notice a few changes, such as possibly having mood swings, parts of her feeling swollen, feeling nauseous, having food cravings, or getting a headache or heartburn. But what's happening on the inside? For the first couple of weeks, there isn't much of a you yet. About 1 week after the sperm won that race and met the egg, the fertilized ovum attaches itself to the uterus lining, and now the placenta starts to form. At about 2 weeks, the embryo looks a bit like a disc on this wall. But it's not until about 4 weeks that this little embryo starts sprouting things. The heart starts to form, and little buds develop where the legs and arms will be. All of this is only about 1/25 of an inch. The ears, eyes, nose all start to develop, as do the spine and the digestive tract. At about 8 weeks, we have something a little bit more human-looking, what we'll call the fetus. The heart is now properly functioning, and the fetus has all the organs, but not fully formed, that the baby-to-be will have. Nascent bones are now also starting to form. At 12 weeks, we are starting to see a tiny human, replete with larger head, genitalia, tooth buds, and even fingernails and toenails. The baby can now move around, too, in what's called amniotic fluid. This is the end of the first trimester. At the beginning of the second trimester, the baby will be about 3 inches long and will weigh around an ounce. The head will stop growing so fast, and the eyelids will close as the eyes develop. Nerves and muscles come into action now, and this tiny fetus can even make a fist. As the fetus is now bigger, many women will now have a noticeable bump. They may also start to feel a bit better and stop having those awful feelings of nausea. Saying that, they might also have a lot of new aches and pains. Under the hood, at 16 weeks, the baby's skeleton keeps developing. The skin looks white, almost see-through. The fetus at this point may have a bowel movement, but it will be something called meconium. It's a dark green substance that's pretty much poop. The fetus is now about 4 or 5 inches long and weighs around 3 ounces. At 20 weeks, the little bundle of joy might seem to get restless, and that's when the woman might start feeling the baby kicking. Many body parts are now fully formed, such as fingernails and toenails. We're told it can even start scratching itself at this point. It can also swallow and hear things. Moving on to week 24, during the second trimester, the baby makes its own blood cells from bone marrow. It now has fingerprints, it can taste things as taste buds form on the tongue, and it will even get a bit of hair. The lungs are not properly developed yet, but that process is on the way. Whether a boy or a girl, the fetus will now start developing its own reproductive organs. Another thing that starts now is a normal sleep cycle. At this point, it's about 12 inches long and might weigh in the region of 1.5 pounds. Welcome to the third trimester, the point in time when the woman is carrying around a lot of extra weight. There will be discomfort at times, and that's just the body reacting to having another thing grow inside of it. At 32 weeks, we almost have the finished package. The baby's bones are not fully developed, but they're getting there. It can now open and close its eyes. Its lungs are still not fully formed, but the baby at this point will be practicing breathing. At this point, the baby is also storing all the natural minerals its body needs to be healthy. Right now, it might be as long as 16 inches and may weigh about 4 pounds or more. At 36 weeks, something called the vernix thickens around the baby. This is a waxy coating that protects the baby. It's now storing a fair bit of body fat, and that means less space to move around. The woman will feel fewer of those kicks. We usually have a fetus now at around 18 inches long and weighing around 6 pounds. After this point, we have the real deal, meaning the fetus has organs that are fully developed for the world outside. As the time draws nearer to birth, the baby may switch into a head-first position. It's just a matter of time now until it comes out and takes its first breaths in the world. When it does, it may weigh about 6 to 9 pounds, but that can change. The length might be around 20 inches, but that can change too. Then what happens? Well, in those first moments after it comes out, the people around may clean the baby and evaluate its health. Its nose and throat will be very gently cleared. The umbilical cord will be clamped in 2 places and then it'll be cut. And in case you didn't know, this cord connects the baby to the woman's womb. It takes oxygen and nutrients to the baby from the placenta. Anyway, after it's cut, it will leave a stump. This will turn dry and just drop off. After around 7 days or more, the belly button should be fully healed. What else happens right after birth? Well, the baby will likely have antibiotic ointment rubbed on its eyes to stop infection. It'll also receive an injection of vitamin K to help its blood clot. As we said, doctors will check if the baby's health is good, but another important thing is to make sure its temperature is right. If all is good, after a few hours it may get a sponge bath. It will then likely get a little cap to wear to keep its little head warm, and in time will get its first taste of mother's milk. Baby and mother can usually go home after 24 to 48 hours, but more tests might need to be done. You might also have to visit the hospital again just for a checkup after a week or so. And that's that. This is how you were born, or, well, close to it. We've all been there, and we are all lucky in some ways to be alive. An indomitable sperm met with an almighty egg after your mother and father had performed nature's life-giving dance. How cool is that? Picture this. You're 22 years old, in the prime of your life, with a pregnant and devoted wife you haven't been married to for very long. And then everything changes one night when a man is murdered in the street. You are accused of the murder, with the evidence being that it was your face a witness saw running from the scene of the crime. That evidence is weak, to say the least. And seeing as you know very well you didn't do it, you're confident you'll get off. But that's not the case, and you'll spend many years behind bars. A trial judge will say you're likely innocent some 20 years after the crime was committed, and you still won't get out. How could this happen? Let's start from the beginning. The man we're talking about is named Benjamin Spencer, and he was convicted along with another man of committing a murder on a quiet street in West Dallas over 30 years ago. On March 22nd in the year of 1987, a 33-year-old named Jeffrey Young, who was doing well for himself at a clothing company, was attacked after walking out of his company office around 9:30 p.m. The police report says he was then manhandled into his BMW by 2 men and drove over to West Dallas, and it's there his body was dumped down a dark alley. Police thought they had gotten lucky when witnesses came forward and said that they saw what happened. There were 3 of those witnesses, and they identified 2 men. One was Spencer and the other was named Robert Mitchell. But as the district attorney of Dallas now says, something might have been amiss because all the witnesses all knew Spencer. These people were not strangers. Spencer was by no means an angel. He'd spent some time behind bars before for driving on a suspended license, and had also been put on probation for 6 years for driving a car that had been stolen by a friend. Nonetheless, as we said, his new wife was pregnant and he was turning over a new leaf. After he was picked up 4 days after the crime, he wasn't very worried. It was just a mistake, a case of mistaken identity. But that wasn't the case at all. Spencer had an alibi too, which was the testimony of a young woman friend of his who said she'd been hanging out with him when the murder and robbery took place. On top of that, there was no physical evidence linking Spencer to the crime, just those witness testimonies. During the robbery, a watch had been stolen, as well as a wedding ring, a small portable TV, and a briefcase. None of these things were found at Spencer's house. Police didn't have any fingerprint evidence, nor was there a murder weapon found. Many years later, Spencer would say in an interview, "I began to think, well, I didn't commit this offense, the truth is going to come out." But a few months down the line, Spencer was sentenced to 35 years in prison, with the evidence being the witness's testimony as well as a jailhouse informant's testimony. It was a nightmare come true. Spencer's heart sank. His life was ruined. The father-to-be had become a condemned man, and the state had failed to do its job in his eyes. But not long into his sentence, Spencer got a break. It turned out that the star witness in his case had lied. She'd not told the truth about whether she had received a reward for coming forward and giving evidence. A new trial was set, but Spencer was then offered a plea deal by the state. He could probably get out in 5 years if he accepted this. But wasn't this 5 years too much? And why would an innocent man taint his name by admitting he killed someone when he hadn't? In his mind, he'd been wronged, and accepting a plea deal was just another wrong in the topsy-turvy world of American justice. Nonetheless, his attorney told him to take it. Years later, Spencer would tell NPR, he was saying, if you take it to trial, they're going to give you a life sentence, and they're likely to get it. And I'm like, I'm not going to plead guilty to something I didn't do. Who in their right mind would? And so he didn't accept the deal. During his second trial, the state prosecuted Spencer for aggravated robbery and asked for a life sentence. The evidence again was a witness testimony, with the star witness being a 42-year-old woman who lived close to the alley where the victim was dumped. It was her testimony that got Spencer convicted again. and as you'll soon find out, her testimony was hardly concrete. But she stood her ground and, according to reports, was very convincing when she described what she had seen on the night of the crime. This was Spencer and Mitchell dumping the body. Mitchell was also convicted again, and unfortunately he would not live much longer anyway. So now Spencer is back in prison again, looking down a long road of 30-something years living life behind bars as an innocent man. His life now would be dedicated to proving his innocence, and this would be a long process. Spencer got in touch with organizations that helped wrongly convicted men who were serving time. One such organization was named Centurion Ministries, and the people there knew that the state had sent down an innocent man. They built a case, interviewed over 100 people, and then asked for a hearing. The petition ended up on the desk of a criminal court judge in Dallas named Rick Magnus. He said he wasn't sure at first whether to have a hearing, mostly because the exoneration wasn't based on any kind of new DNA evidence. This is often what gets innocent people freed. But he later said in interviews that the more he read about the case, he realized there had been a lot of wrongs in Spencer's conviction. 20 years after the crime, Magnus granted an evidentiary hearing. The witnesses came forward again, and this time 2 of them backed down. But that woman who lived across from the alley didn't. She stood firm again. She said she had definitely seen Spencer. As we said, there was a big problem with her testimony. That's because all those years later, a forensic visual scientist was asked to watch a reenactment of the body being dumped. What that was people in the dark pretending to be the pair that dumped the body. After this, there was no doubt that this woman could have seen anything other than a silhouette. No way she could have clearly seen a face as she said she had done. That forensic scientist said with the conditions as they were, a person could not have made out a face any farther than 25 feet away. But as it stood, the witness claiming to have seen the man who was standing closest to the crime scene was 93 feet away. Again, just no way could any of those witnesses have got a clear ID. With this new evidence, Judge Magnus said, okay, enough is enough, and he ordered a retrial on the grounds of something called actual innocence. As for Spencer, he said he was over the moon when he heard the news. Not only would he get out, but he would clear his name too. In an interview, he said, I was very hopeful. I thought that this is it, I'm going home. That didn't happen though. Spencer said at first he was hopeful that his retrial would take place within a few weeks. They passed, so then he thought maybe a few months, and they passed. In fact, years passed, and the only authority capable of granting a new trial, the Court of Criminal Appeals, it seems, did nothing at all. Then in 2011, Spencer got some bad news. There would be no retrial. While a judge said that indeed if the new evidence had been presented at the first trial, it would have been unlikely that Spencer would have been convicted. But that same judge said because Spencer hadn't come up with any incontrovertible new evidence proving he wasn't there that night, such as CCTV footage or DNA that had never been tested, there would be no trial. The judge admitted that Spencer was likely innocent, but it didn't matter. He didn't have the evidence to get that new trial. His attorney now says that she needs to start again. She needs to find this new evidence proving her client's innocence. The problem, of course, is how do you find new evidence 28 years after the fact? The woman across from the alley now won't talk openly about the case. Another witness died, and another now says that she didn't get a clear look at Spencer. The witness now says he felt pressured by the police to say it was Spencer. So that's it. The only thing saying Spencer is guilty is the testimony of a witness who it's been proven couldn't have possibly seen Spencer that night. Everyone seems to know the case stinks, but the fact is the justice system doesn't seem to provide any solutions to get Spencer out. But there's more. There was another witness, but this witness was never called. She now says that she is 1000% sure that the people she saw didn't include Spencer. What about that jailhouse informant? Well, he now says that Spencer never told him he had committed the crime. Records also show something very fishy. The informant said in court that he had not received any benefit from giving that statement. But this guy was looking at a 25-year sentence for aggravated robbery. Guess what happened after he spoke to the police and gave his testimony? He walked out of prison after just more than a year. Another person has come forward saying he knows who killed the man that night because it was a friend of his who did it. He admitted it to him. This man did not come forward at the time because he didn't want to rat on one of his friends. The man whose name was put forward is currently serving time for robbery and assault. Investigators now say that police weren't going after Spencer, but they just had a case of what's called tunnel vision. They had a theory and they looked only at the evidence that fit that theory. Anything else was ignored. Spencer now sits in his cell, a man in his 50s wearing glasses, waiting and hoping, but he doesn't have too much hope left. In an interview, he said, "I'm just at a point where I'm still hopeful, but at the same time, it's like I'm stuck in the system." His story has been written about extensively in the American media, but it seems this man really is stuck in the system. He's been denied parole on each occasion he was up for it, and from what we can see, still waits in his cell to this day, waiting in vain for something to help him get him out of the web of American justice. As we've said in previous shows, not everyone using the dark web is doing something criminal. In some ways, this corner of the internet gets a bad name, and research has shown many of the darkest things supposedly happening in the dark web have been exaggerated. That said, it's well known that many people, mainly the younger generation, go there to buy illegal substances that they may have otherwise procured on the street. It's also well known that people with strange inclinations visit this place to chat with others that share their fascination with what we might call the more eccentric aspects of life. If you've seen our shows on the dark web, you'll know that finding it is not that hard at all. The question is, should you go there? That's what we'll discuss in this episode of the Infographics Show, why you should avoid the dark web. Let's just give you a quick recap on the dark web, as you may not have seen all our other shows on this place. It's said that only around 10% of the internet is the internet as we know it, meaning the part we can all access. Much of the rest of the internet we call the deep web, which is just the part of the World Wide Web that's not indexed by search engines such as Google. It's a common mistake to think the dark web and the deep web are the same. The dark web is just a small part of the deep web. Many people give it the example of an iceberg. The bit at the top that we can see is the internet as we know it. The main part that lies under the water is the deep web, and the dark web is just a very small part around the very bottom of the iceberg. This is naturally where people go when they don't want to be found. That might be because they have a store there selling the aforementioned illegal substances, or it might just be because they're living in a country that has very oppressive laws on speech. In the dark web, you'll find sites that end with .onion. These websites are not accessible using your regular browser, but you can easily download the Tor browser, and before you can say, "Where am I?" you'll be in the dark web. Here you should have complete anonymity. Okay, so the question is, should you go there? Well, firstly, you should know that the dark web, of course, is of interest to authorities. Illegal things happen there, so we can expect authorities to keep an eye on the place. You should also know that the Tor browser has vulnerabilities. With this in mind, you might ask just how safe is your anonymity? We might also ask if there are other reasons why you should not visit the dark web, reasons more related to you finding things that you probably shouldn't have found. With the latter concern in mind, we looked at Reddit and Quora posts containing people talking about negative experiences on the dark web. We can't vouch for the honesty of these posts, but indeed there are people out there who said they came across things in the dark web they wish they would have never seen. One person on Quora wrote, "I browsed dark web for well over half a year before a horrible experience made me quit. That experience sounded very nasty, and it's not something we want to recount here. Let's just say it involved a video of someone being hurt." Now, others say this kind of thing is very unusual, even for the dark web, but we must remember that it does happen, because an Australian man was put in prison for making such videos. Unless you're sick to the bone, this is not the kind of thing one wants to see in life, so we can say that one reason not to go to the dark web might be because out of curiosity, you see something you might not ever be able to forget. Another person who used the dark web said he looked at forums where he found what he called weird stuff. By that he meant people talking about hurting others, discussing gore, and talking about depraved things such as wanting to eat people. And yet another person said he witnessed what he called a very creepy video. He said there were about 50 people watching this video, again relating to someone being hurt. In this case not very hurt, but still not something people would want to see. And many of the folks watching this video were making what he called obscene comments. Another person on the same thread said he was just hitting random links when he came across a cooking section, only the cooking involved humans. This wasn't a video but a how-to kind of section. "I was traumatized for a few days," he said, because he just read the comments. So unless you want to be traumatized, we suggest you might give the dark web a wide berth. We're quite sure you have to go looking for this kind of stuff, however, so perhaps if you have to go there, just be careful what you search for. As one website that gives advice on the dark web tells us, it's easy to click suspicious links or partake in criminal activity. That website says some of these links are deceptive, and before you know it, you're virtually living in the realms of the demented. We looked at another website called darkwebnews.com. It told us that many people access the dark web without using the Tor browser. It said this can be done with websites such as Tor2Web and Onion2Web. The problem here is that you are exposed, and this puts you at risk of being hacked. Other than that, many people do use the Tor browser, but they don't use a VPN. The problem here is that the Tor has been cracked a few times, and if that happens, your URL can be seen. Okay, so you only went to that disgusting site out of sheer curiosity, but still you went there, and it might not look good for you when your local newspaper has a headline that goes something along the lines of "Boy 17 caught downloading images of XXXX on the dark web." We're also told that you should not enable scripts on .onion sites, which is what many people do. When you do this, we're told you can leave yourself open to hacking, or you just might find a Trojan horse has gotten into your computer. You might also accidentally download files from the dark web, and this is a big no-no. Still, people might just do this by accident, but the big thing to remember, according to that same expert, is don't think that what you're doing on the dark web is illegal. The person says if you're viewing a site on the dark web for any reason, from actually desiring to acquire these products or services, or just to wanting to quench your thirst for knowledge on the subject, know that you may be held liable for what you come across. With that in mind, have people been arrested for using the dark web? Well, in 2018, the US media reported that authorities had made a huge bust of people selling illegal things in the dark web. Engadget tells us that these authorities announced the first ever national-level undercover bust of dark web outfits selling drugs, weapons, and other contraband. Now, perhaps you'd visited some of those sites that got taken down. Again, it was just out of curiosity, but if they could find the owners of the sites, what's to bet that you could have been exposed? It's just not something you want to happen to you, and it might not matter that you went to those sites innocently. Other websites tell us that the FBI and police from all over the world are regularly inside the dark web. Sometimes they go undercover and manage to find the address where parcels are delivered. The Indian media tells us that arrests were made in 2017 by the Mumbai Anti-Narcotics Cell when some boys had ordered LSD from the dark web. Arrests have also been made of the sellers. In one such case in the UK, a bunch of students at Manchester University were arrested after making a fortune on the dark web selling illegal substances. The Guardian wrote 3 gang who compared themselves to the Breaking Bad character Walter White included undergraduates studying pharmacology, computer science, petrochemical engineering, geology, and marketing. In another case in 2016, a young British doctor was arrested for buying drugs and sentenced to over 4 years in prison. The press tells us that in the UK from 2017 to 2018, there were 1,210 drug seizures relating to the dark web, so it might not be as safe as you think scoring your gear there. Police in the UK said buying your stuff on the dark web carries more risk than buying it in the streets. Because if your purchase came from abroad, you could be said to be an importer. The police also added that mail services in the UK are getting very good at spotting packages containing such substances. Okay, so let's say you have no intention of reading or viewing gruesome content or procuring a dozen MDMA pills or some such stimulant. But then we might ask, why are you in the dark web in the first place? Perhaps you have a legitimate reason in that you want to discuss a sensitive issue about yourself, or you're a whistleblower or an at-risk activist. In that case, go ahead and get down with the dark web. But if you don't have those sorts of reasons, one could argue that using the dark web is not worth the risk. Motherboard wrote in 2016 that authorities have developed very sophisticated ways of finding people in the dark web. As we said, sometimes they're undercover. The FBI have been known to sell weapons on the dark web, and who knows where they might be lurking. Motherboard also tells us that the FBI set up one hack wherein a user clicked on a link that was supposed to take them to an unseemingly illegal image. That person's IP address became known to the FBI. What if you had just clicked on that link by accident? What if your curiosity just got the better of you? As a part of the operation, the FBI harvested over 1,000 US-based IP addresses, and Europol generated 3,229 of its own cases, wrote Motherboard. That article tells us that police units in many countries have now dedicated task forces concentrating on the dark web. So you might ask if you really want to be there. Maybe you went there already and did something illegal. Well, we're told that when police make an arrest of a vendor or someone doing something illegal, they often collect IP addresses of people who had connected with that person or persons. One summer afternoon, you find yourself cleaning out the dusty old attic of the new home you've moved into. It's a bit out in the countryside and out of the way, but it came cheap. The owner seemed very willing to sell it. So willing, in fact, that they seem to have left at least half of their possessions up here in the attic. And as you're sorting through the things to trash, things to sell, and things to keep, you come across a strange book. It has a simple red cover with just a title, no author, Mr. BABADOOK. As you open the book, you're surprised to discover that it looks like a children's pop-up book, except there's something oddly disturbing about it.
For one, it features a creepy figure dressed in a long black coat and a top hat with what looks like long claws for hands. And for the other, it comes with the following piece of disturbing poetry. If it's in a word or it's in a look, you can't get rid of the Babadook. You read that simple poem aloud, and suddenly you think you hear shuffling of feet in the darkness of the attic. Looking up, you're startled to see the figure from the book. It's real! As it rears up its full height and displays its clawed hands, you suddenly understand why the owners decided to sell this house so cheap. Hello and welcome to another episode of You Versus. Today we're putting you up against the legendary demon of grief, the Babadook. No one is sure about the origins of the Babadook, save to say that it's been around at least since the late Victorian era, given its predisposition for the long coats and top hats so popular at the time. The Babadook could of course be much older than that, given that it seems to be mystically linked to a pop-up book that bears its full name. The first pop-up books were made in the late 13th century, and it's possible that the Babadook has been around as long as they have. However, as a demon, the Babadook is likely a far more ancient being, haunting humanity since its inception. Its connection to the pop-up book in question may just be its chosen avenue of haunting its victims, or perhaps part of some mystical banishment the demon suffered at some point in its past. Whatever the origins, you're gonna have to know what you're up against if you're in the Babadook's crosshairs. As usual, this will be a fight to the death, or at least a fight to banish the Babadook, since it's likely that as a demon it cannot die. So what are you potentially facing? First and foremost, the Babadook is in fact a demon, which places it in a category aside from spirits, monsters, ghouls, or other things that go bump in the night. As a demon, this means that the Babadook is more intelligent than a spirit or a ghoul, and thus far more crafty and manipulative. It understands humanity in a way that other supernatural creatures can't, as it draws both from its immortal lifespan of experiences and higher intelligence, and thus knows what makes us tick and how to exploit all of our fears. Fear is important because as a demon, the Babadook is much like a spirit, strengthened by fear, and the more scared its victims become, the more powerful that the Babadook becomes. The Babadook is, however, specifically a demon of grief and prefers to target people who have been made vulnerable by deep sadness, depression, and loss in their lives. Its hauntings are geared to further deepen those feelings of hopelessness, pain, and loss, until finally pushing its victims into either letting it possess them or doing great acts of violence. The Babadook has an arsenal of powers at its disposal and will prove difficult to counter. First and foremost, it has the ability to teleport at will, though it does show a preference to teleport to dark and shadowy areas as opposed to brightly lit spaces. This may mean that the Babadook is tied to the shadows of the world and can move through them freely, but has difficulty using its powers to escape in bright light. This isn't its only trick though, as the Babadook also displays a formidable talent for telekinesis, able to move objects as large as a couch with its mind. It can also shapeshift into people the victim is familiar with, or into mundane objects, though is given away upon closer inspection, so it has an imperfect talent for mimicry. Lastly, it's a keen manipulator, using its ability to inflict terror on its victims to gradually break down their mental defenses until they do things that the Babadook wants, which is typically to commit violence. So you're up against the dreaded Babadook. How are you going to defeat this demon of grief? First, you're going to want to defeat its ability to randomly teleport at will through the shadows. This will be key in order to keep the Babadook from getting the drop on you, and so that you can make sure to land a killing blow when the time comes. In order to counter the Babadook's ability to randomly teleport away from you, you're going to want to get your hands on a piece of hardware like the BABADOok LED searchlight, which can put out as much as 6,000 lumens up to a range of 800 meters. That's half as bright as the sun reflecting off white snow, and prolonged exposure directly to the eyes can lead to permanent vision problems. With a miniature sun in your hands, you'll be able to blast away even the deepest, darkest shadows, and with the ability to flood, you'll scatter any shadows directly in front of you, leaving no room for the Babadook to hide. Of course, that still leaves all the dark areas behind you that it could try to flee to. So you're going to need something that can light up really large areas, like the rising of a second sun. And nothing can light up large swaths of ground quite like an Aramax. The tool of choice by professional filmmakers who will need to work outdoors in the middle of the night, the Aramax is a whopping 18,000 watt light that can be hoisted up into the air on a crane or secured to a sturdy tree. With this monster light blasting your surroundings, the Babadook will have absolutely nowhere to hide. So you've taken care of its ability to teleport, leaving the Babadook with nowhere to hide. You'll have to watch out for its ability to use telekinesis to move objects around, which it will no doubt try to use as a weapon against you. But as long as you're keeping a sharp eye on your environment and keeping your head on a swivel, you should be fine. What you should be most concerned about is its ability to manipulate your fears. Like many evil creatures that go bump in the night, the Babadook is strengthened by fear, so you're gonna have to keep a firm grip on what scares you. Unlike other demons or similar creatures that feed on fear though, the Babadook specifically feeds off grief as well, and fear that stems from that grief. So your next weapon is going to be to arm yourself with some peace of mind. If you're holding on to any particular pain or loss, let it go. Try to be grateful for the things that you already have in your life, and try to take joy in the accomplishments you achieve, such as the imminent Babadook kill you're about to score because you're a Zen master, and this shifty demon can't find any weak spots in your psyche to exploit. You've stripped the Babadook of its ability to teleport away. You've remembered the 5 Ds of dodgeball, and dodged, ducked, dipped, dove, and dodged. Everything it's tried to hurl at you with telekinesis. And when it tried to manipulate your grief and fear, you shut the Babadook down with a Dalai Lama-like level of self-mastery. Now it's time to go for the kill and end this deathmatch once and for all, sending this demon of grief back to the fiery hell that spawned it. As you probably know by now from watching our other episodes, we here at the Infographics Show are fans of problem solving through superior firepower. And in this case, we have one and only one tool to recommend. A surefire way to blast this hellspawn out of this world and back into its own. The Super Soaker Scatterblast Blaster. That's right, a squirt gun. Only not any regular type of squirt gun, a 22-ounce beast that can deliver shotgun-like blasts of water up to 34 feet away. Except you're not going to be blasting the Babadook with any regular type of water. You're going to be using holy water blessed by a priest. As a demon, the Babadook is bound to rules of our prime material plane. If it chooses to manifest physically, that means that the Babadook took solid form in order to directly manipulate our world. Then its body would be subject to the same rules as our own bodies or anything else physical, in which case we'd recommend firepower on a level much higher than the squirt gun. However, because the Babadook doesn't manifest physically, it can't be harmed physically. That's why it needs to haunt victims in order to eventually wear them down and commit the violence it can't commit itself. So to excommunicate this demon out of our world and back to its own, at least temporarily, you're gonna have to hit it with the only thing all demons can't stand, corporal or non-corporal, holy water. Water blessed by true faith in the divine is the anathema to evil, and has the power not just to hurt evil, but to dispel it altogether. With a tank full of blessed water, your Super Soaker Scatter Blaster is a demon blasting weapon that Michael the Archangel would be envious of. That is, of course, if the water you're using has been blessed by a priest with true faith, something very, very rare in our world today. Otherwise, well, you're really only going to be making a very angry demon soaking wet, moments before it rips your soul from your body and inhabits you forever. In terms of mysteries of the criminal world and the whodunit question that eclipses all others, there is nothing more mysterious than who was Jack the Ripper. You might have seen countless movies on the subject, read myriad books on the topic, or listened to a plethora of online sleuths that think they have cracked the mystery. But let's face it, it was always a guessing game. There's been absurd speculation as well as more thorough investigation. But the man that eviscerated women on the streets of London has never had his Scooby-Doo-esque denouement. But as we speak, we're hearing some new pesky kids are on the block, and they might have figured this mystery out. We've already done our Jack the Ripper show, an epic if we say so for ourselves, that was welcomed by our viewers. You might not have seen that, so for those of you who are not versed in the history of this serial killer, we'll give you a quick rundown on the strife and crimes of Mr. Ripper. 'Twas the 1880s in the city of London, perhaps the center of the world at the time, but also in parts a dirty, rotten, festering maze of slums, replete with wandering gin addicts and foul-mouthed harlots. London was experiencing a population explosion, with immigrants from around the world coming to the great city to find work. But it wasn't exactly the land of hope and glory for everybody, and some of the streets in the poorer east end of the city were a long way from being a yellow brick road. The rise in population not surprisingly caused friction between the new denizens and the ones born on the cobbled streets, while the factory owners were happy for the cheap labor. These were fractious times, and outbreaks of violence and other criminality were common. This is where our man, Jack the Ripper, chose to ply his trade. You might ask, what was his trade? Well, that was nabbing mostly working girls from the streets and brutally killing them. He might tear at their faces with a sharp blade like a wild animal might do, but other times he skillfully removed their organs with the deft hands of a surgeon. For this, he became known as the Ripper. Other Rippers would follow in the years to come.
the Yorkshire Ripper up north in Bradford, or over the pond, the Ripper of Times Square, but they were different. Jack may well have been educated in human anatomy, and as we say, he had the precise skills it takes for surgical exploration and organ removal. It's thought he may have murdered 11 people, but the cops only ever said for sure that he killed 5. These became known as the Canonical Five. We don't often attribute canons to killers, but Jack was special. The British media lapped it up, publishing piece after piece on this boogeyman that wandered the dark streets at night. Police interviewed thousands of Londoners. They summarily locked up people, hired sleuths, and patrolled the streets and alleyways 24/7. But Jack eluded them. Was he a surgeon? A physician? Was he some educated upper-class untouchable? What made things worse is police received letters, many with atrocious grammar and spelling skills, which were supposedly from the killer. Many were just hoaxes written by bored East Enders who had little or no respect for the cops. But one letter titled "From Hell" police believed was real. They never got their man, and the case went on for years. There have been some main suspects over time, and no, serious ripperologists don't give credence to the possibility of him being the aristocrat Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, the Duke of Clarence. That just makes a compelling tale, and something the poor disenfranchised Brits would love to be true, because it might vindicate their conviction of the ruling class being wicked. No one seriously thought it was the creator of Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, despite the clamoring of some rather wide-eyed conspiracy theorists. Was it a cover-up, many asked? Because in such an intractable class system, you just can't have the people at the top of the pyramid ripping young girls to pieces and evacuating their uterus. That would have been poor play by the toffs in charge. So perhaps Jack's identity was known, but this theory didn't pass muster. None of them did. Not until now. There has been one name on the list of men behind the Ripper mask, but he hasn't been talked about much until now. His name was Aaron Kosminski. Occupation? Barber. Yep, imagine getting a close shave from a Polish barber with a penchant for slicing people open. How do we know it was him? Well, according to a forensic investigation published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in March 2019, they know this because of DNA found on a shawl of one of his victims. Okay, so you might have heard this before, and indeed, in our very own Jack the Ripper show, we said there was one theory about Kosminski because of his DNA. But the trouble back then was that none of the DNA evidence was supported. It was mostly down to a well-off businessman and Ripper researcher called Russell Edwards. The thing is, that evidence was not peer-reviewed by any number of other scientists. It has been now. We're told that 2 researchers called Jari Lohelainen and David Miller ran genetic tests on semen and blood on that shawl we just mentioned that was found next to the murdered Catherine Eddowes. They then compared mitochondrial DNA from Eddowes' present family members, as well as people from the present Kosminski family. They concluded that the Ripper was indeed one of their ancestors. They also said it's very likely Jack the Ripper had blue eyes and brown hair. And this is what many mainstream news media was reporting. Finally, we found our man. Jack the Lad was a 23-year-old Pole that went to London and trimmed mustaches, cut hair, and also the odd stomach wide open. Researchers wrote in that paper that the shawl referred to in this paper is the only piece of physical evidence known to be associated with these murders. The DNA found on that shawl should be passed down from mother to mother, and DNA could be traced back to the Polish man's family. We know quite a bit about our boy, who moved over to the Whitechapel area, a slum in London, and there he set up shop. But it said in 1891 Mr. Kosminski was sent to one of London's finest insane asylums. He was apparently an on and off lunatic, doing some barber work and then being looked after by his family. And then sometimes he was back inside with the people screaming at the moon. It said he suffered a kind of psychosis. It's also said that his utterly insane behavior led to him being sent to the workhouse. What we have is a man who was in and out of asylums while those murders were going on. So you could say his face now fits the picture. God knows who his customers were at the barbershop in Whitechapel, or if he had packed that in once he started to hear voices, eat trash from the streets, and self-abuse. That was a fine English euphemism for what the Brits later would call a five-knuckle shuffle. There's also evidence in those psychiatric reports that he had threatened a sister with a knife.
The thing is, of course, he doesn't sound much like a skilled surgeon, nor a man who was adroit enough to never leave any evidence behind. And then we have the naysayers. These critics were doubtful of the first time the Polish man was connected to the murders and say the latest conclusions were partly predicated on that original 2014 paper. Forbes reported just after everyone was saying finally we found him that the new paper contained 3 parts hogwash. We're sorry to burst your bubble, but Forbes cites a group of archaeological geneticists who said that even if the shawl was left behind by a victim, still the way it's been handled since would render DNA analysis cripplingly problematic. Why is that? Well, it's been an item over the year that has been passed around, touched by many, many hands, and left in places for people to view. It's hardly a fine specimen for DNA analysis, said the scientists. Another British geneticist wrote this: "How did this ever get past review? Primers not listed, data not presented. Was it done in a proper forensic DNA lab? Unpublishable. Steady on, old chap. Surely you can't just discount the new paper." Well, one other person in the geneticist milieu said this: the suspect couldn't have passed on his mitochondrial DNA, as he was a man. These academics don't mince their words either, sometimes sounding like they were prepared to take a straight razor to the jugular of those that published the paper. Nonsense like this paper and gullible media does nothing but foment scientific and historical illiteracy, built upon the grotesque romanticism of the brutal murders of 5 women, said one of them. No doubt words spat through a mist of strong English tea and bits of scone. But as some academics pointed out, you can't just go around saying it was the Kosminski kid without having absolute irrefutable proof, if only because there are a bunch of people in Poland, or perhaps still in England, whose friends have suddenly started hiding the knives when they've been invited around for dinner. The question of his identity, I am confident, will never be known, concluded the angry professor we just quoted. As some commenters say, if Kosminski did do it, was he really clever enough to just disappear after each murder? How come he never told anyone else, not even when he was locked up? Where did he get the surgical skills from? Can we not find out if any one of the murders happened during the spurts he had outside of the asylum? As for the new evidence, the researchers have admitted that they would not use it if it were for a present criminal trial. Can we rely on that shawl and the new results? We might tell you what one other scientist in the biogame said, and he was less critical than that angry mob of geneticists. The data, at least in the weak form presented here, increased the likelihood that Aaron Kosminski, who was a suspect in the murders, was the killer, he said. But we're a long way from knowing who butchered those 5 women. Caveat lector. What do you think about all of this? Tell us in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other show, Why Was Jack the Ripper Never Found? Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.